Hey everyone! Tonight we're wandering back into the fog, into a city of whispers, footsteps, and flickering gaslight. A city where the streets never truly slept, and neither did the fears that lived beneath them. Welcome to the dark alleys of Victorian murder houses. This isn't a story of ghosts, not really. It's a story about walls that remember, about rooms that once held screams, footsteps, and silence, all soaked into the brickwork of an empire that called itself civilized. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And in the comments tell me, where are you listening from tonight? What's the time where you are? Because somewhere, as you listen, another city sleeps under the same kind of light, yellow, dim, and heavy with memory. Now turn down your lights, maybe let a candle burn low, or just listen in the quiet hum of your room, and together we'll step softly into the alleys of Victorian London, a place where the gas lamps hissed, the cobblestones glistened, and behind closed curtains, history took its darkest breath. Let's begin. In the heart of mid-19th century London, the air hung thick with the dull ache of coal smoke and the slow heartbeat of industry. Day and night seemed to merge beneath a sky veiled in soot. As daylight faded, the city transformed into a vast, restless organism that refused to sleep. Gas lamps flickered to life, each one a pale orb suspended in the fog, casting halos through the haze that drifted from 1,000 chimneys. The Thames moved sluggishly through it all, its waters black and glinting, reflecting the dim orange of distant fires. By the middle of the century, London had become the largest city in the world, a swelling, breathing mass of more than 2 million people. The city's heart expanded outward, swallowing villages and farmlands, replacing them with endless terraces of brick and soot. Its sounds were never still, the hiss of steam, the clatter of hooves, the rattle of iron wheels over cobblestone, the constant ringing of church bells marking hours that no longer meant rest. The city was divided not by walls, but by wealth. In one district stood marble-faced townhouses and glittering theatres, where the air smelled faintly of perfume and coal tar. In another, a few streets away, entire families lived pressed together in single rooms with cracked plaster and damp walls. These were the rookeries, narrow mazes of lodging houses and tenements that had grown out of neglect and necessity. Streets like Field Lane, St. Giles, and the Old Nickel were crammed with the city's poorest hawkers, factory hands, washerwomen, pickpockets, and the forgotten. Their alleys were narrow enough for 2 people to brush shoulders, and yet the noise of life filled every inch. Coughing, crying, quarrels, the splash of slop water, the shuffle of feet that never stopped moving. The smell of coal dominated everything. It was the city's perfume, and its poison. Factories burned it by the ton, homes by the shovelful. The smoke rose in endless columns, merging into the low clouds that hung over London like a lid. At night it combined with mist from the Thames, creating the infamous pea soup fogs, thick, yellowish blankets that swallowed the streets whole. On such nights, visibility could drop to just a few feet. The lamps along the Strand and Fleet Street became dim orbs in a golden sea, and people moved with hands outstretched, their footsteps cautious and hollow. In wealthier areas like Bloomsbury and Kensington, the lamps burned brighter, but even here, soot gathered on windowsills and lace curtains. Gaslight, new and wondrous, carried its own danger. Its faint hiss filled drawing rooms and parlours, its warm glow giving illusion of comfort. But behind that glow, the city was breathing something darker, carbon, ash, and unspoken dread. The fire that powered its progress was also blackening its lungs. The Thames, winding like a slow, polluted artery, reflected this contradiction perfectly. Barges drifted heavy with coal and refuse, ferrying waste downstream as the city dumped its byproducts into the same water it drew for washing and drinking. On humid nights, the stench from the river rolled inland, clinging to the walls and the air. The riverbanks were lined with warehouses and wharves, their doors yawning open into blackness, their walls sweating from the damp. The water itself gleamed faintly in the lamplight, a mirror to everything the city wished to ignore. In these conditions, sound travelled strangely. The city seemed muffled under its own smoke. The distant toll of church bells, the hollow echo of boots on wet stones, the rhythmic drip from gutters, all of it formed a kind of heartbeat, a slow throb in the night. On rare windless evenings, when the fog pressed close, even that rhythm seemed to fade, replaced by the almost imperceptible murmur of breathing buildings. Within the tenements, families huddled together in rooms barely large enough for a table and a bed. Water seeped through the brickwork, plaster blistered from the damp, wallpaper yellowed from smoke, and the touch of countless hands. The air was close, thick with cooking, sweat, and illness. Fireplaces, when they existed, were small and seldom warm. In such spaces, night was not a time for rest, it was a long, uneven stretch between exhaustion and waking. Meanwhile, a few miles away, the carriages of the wealthy rolled home from theatres and dinners. Gaslight shone on polished brass, on the glossy hides of horses, on the high collars of men who discussed politics and progress, unaware, or unwilling to remember, that progress had a price. They passed under the same fog through the same air, but they lived in another world entirely. London's nights belonged to no one, and everyone. The lamplighters moved from post to post, touching flame to the lamps before disappearing again. Policemen walked their beats with oilskin capes, their truncheons hidden beneath the folds. Street vendors sold roasted chestnuts, their carts glowing in the gloom. Beggars gathered near the bridges, calling softly into the mist. The city seen from above would have resembled a dim constellation, points of light suspended in a vast black sea, each one trembling against the darkness. And yet, for all its movement, the night carried an unease. It was as if the city's breath came slower after dark. The fog thickened, the gaslight blurred, faces in the street became indistinct. The line between living and shadow began to thin. London did not sleep, but it seemed to dream, and the dreams were seldom kind. Somewhere, beyond the lamplight, a door slammed, a cry echoed briefly and was lost in the mist. Horses clattered past, vanishing into sound before shape. Behind curtained windows, secrets multiplied, arguments, debts, betrayals, and crimes that the gaslight never reached. The city was not only awake, it was watching itself, breathing, waiting. And out of these restless nights, in the places where the fog clung thickest and the alleys ran deepest, another city was growing, a hidden one, unseen by daylight, but alive in the shadows beneath. Out of the restless night of smoke and gaslight, a second city began to rise, not in the grand avenues and stone facades, but beneath them, behind them, between them. A city within a city, it spread quietly, without plan or permission, built from the cast-offs of progress. While the respectable world of Victorian London dreamed of order and empire, another London festered in its forgotten corners, a hidden city of slums, rookeries, and passageways so narrow that even moonlight hesitated to enter. By the mid-19th century, the polite society of the West End had built itself upon the misery of the East. The same industrial revolution that filled the docks and fueled the railways had also drawn hundreds of thousands of labourers into the capital, seeking work, survival, or anonymity. They came from Ireland, Scotland, the English countryside, and later from across Europe, each wave adding to the swelling population that the city could neither house nor feed adequately. Landlords, sensing opportunity, divided once proud Georgian homes into cramped, decaying tenements. A single house might shelter 10, 20, or 50 people, each family occupying one room, sometimes only a corner curtained off from others. Here, light was rare, air was foul, and space itself became a luxury. Windows were few, and often blocked by adjoining walls. Streets, where they existed, were more like corridors, damp, uneven, and littered with refuse. Children played barefoot among broken glass and coal dust. Water came from shared pumps that ran brown in the summer heat and froze in winter. Disease was a regular tenant: cholera, typhus, consumption. The great stink of 1858, when the Thames turned so foul that even Parliament could not sit, was not an isolated event, but a symptom of the city's larger sickness, a physical manifestation of overcrowding, poverty and neglect. In districts like Whitechapel, Spitalfields, St Giles, and the Old Nickel, the buildings seemed to lean inward over the narrow lanes, shutting out the sky. The bricks were blackened by soot, the roofs sagged under their own age. In these streets time moved differently. The respectable hours of the day meant little. Night was not a time of rest, but a continuation of labor, of vice, of survival. Here the gaslight seldom reached. Only the faint glow from a gin shop window or the dull red ember of a pipe broke the darkness. The social reformers who ventured into these quarters often wrote of them as another world entirely. Henry Mayhew, in his Surveys of London's Poor, described rookeries so densely packed that a ray of light rarely visited the court. Rooms were so small that a family of 6 might sleep in a space the size of a carriage. Bedding, when it existed, was a heap of straw. The smell of damp brick, stale gin, and unwashed bodies hung constantly in the air. Rats moved freely through the drains, the walls, and even over sleeping children. Yet, for all its misery, the hidden city was alive. It had its own markets, its own customs, its own rhythm of existence. Street vendors sold roasted potatoes or eels from steaming tubs. Women carried trays of flowers or pins, their voices thin and persistent. The sound of street musicians, fiddles, hand organs, the occasional accordion drifted through the alleys. Children ran barefoot in the rain, laughing or fighting in puddles of black water. And when darkness deepened, another trade emerged: the taverns, brothels, and thieves' kitchens that formed the underbelly of the empire's capital. Every shadow seemed to hold a secret. In the rookeries, law enforcement hesitated to enter without numbers. Many lanes were unmarked on maps, deliberately hidden by landlords who feared attention. Behind certain doors, the poor lived shoulder to shoulder with criminals, deserters, and the desperate. The boundaries blurred between survival and crime. A loaf stolen, a pocket picked, a debt unpaid. Each small act echoed through this enclosed world like a ripple in stagnant water. Respectable London preferred not to look too closely. The city fathers built new parks and monuments. Newspapers boasted of imperial power and moral progress. Yet beneath the carriages of Hyde Park and the polished shop fronts of Regent Street, this other London was spreading, inch by inch, foundation by foundation. It had no architects, no design, and no beauty by intention, but it had life. It grew wherever neglect allowed, filling every crack the city left behind. Visitors from abroad sometimes spoke of the strange contrast they found in London, the proximity of splendor and squalor. The French writer Hippolyte Taine remarked that London is 2 cities, one rich, magnificent, and proud, the other poor, foul, and invisible. In truth, they were not separate at all. They were bound together, each feeding on the other. The wealth of one depended on the labor and silence of the other. The hidden city also became a place of refuge for those who wished to vanish. Among its labyrinthine streets, names could be changed, pasts erased, runaway apprentices, unwed mothers, debtors, and thieves disappeared here. For some, anonymity meant safety, for others it meant being forgotten entirely. The walls of the tenements absorbed their voices, their stories, their fears. When someone died, of illness, of drink, or by another's hand, their absence was often noted by no one. The authorities tried, from time to time, to reform these districts. Model dwellings were built, charities established, missions founded, but the city's hidden half was resilient. It adapted to every attempt to control it, finding new alleys, new courtyards, new basements. It was a living organism, shaped by necessity, sustained by desperation. And as it grew, so too did the darkness within it. The boundaries between poverty and danger blurred until they were indistinguishable. The city that never slept had given birth to a second one that did not wish to be seen at all. It was here, in these narrow lanes and windowless rooms, that something else began to stir. Not yet the crimes that would make headlines, not yet the horrors that would seize the public imagination, but the quiet conditions that made them possible. The polished world above remained unaware. But the hidden city was waiting, its silence thick as soot, its alleys watching, its doors closed upon secrets the daylight could not endure. And in those dim interiors, the staircases that creaked, the rooms that smelled of damp wool and candle wax, the architecture of fear was quietly taking shape. The walls of the hidden city were not merely structures of brick and mortar, they were monuments to a society that prized appearances above compassion, propriety above humanity. London's buildings, even in their decay, revealed the psychology of the age. They were designed not just to contain people, but to separate them, to divide classes, conceal sins, and maintain the illusion of moral order. But as the city expanded, and the population swelled beyond its means, this architecture began to betray its purpose. What was once a symbol of discipline became a labyrinth of despair. The terraced house, so distinctly Victorian, stood as the physical embodiment of middle-class ambition. From the outside, it offered neat symmetry, red brick facades, uniform windows, and tidy iron railings. To the casual eye, it represented the order and respectability that Victorians worshipped. But behind those identical doors, life varied drastically. A house built for one family was often divided and subdivided until each room served as a dwelling. Parlours became bedrooms, kitchens turned into workshops, basements into damp, lightless cells. Privacy, once a virtue, transformed into isolation. These narrow, repeating structures lined entire streets, built cheaply and quickly to meet the demand of the booming city. Developers cut costs wherever possible. Thin walls, hollow floors, low ceilings, and minimal ventilation. The emphasis was on quantity, not safety. Fire spread easily, disease even more so. Staircases creaked and tilted with use. Gas lamps hissed, their fumes thickening in rooms with no airflow. The architecture itself began to mirror the unease of the people who inhabited it. Tight, claustrophobic, and secretive. The lodging houses were worse. Often unlicensed, they hid behind unmarked doors in the city's poorest quarters. For a penny a night, a man could rent a space on a floor or a shared bed. In the four-penny coffin houses, a few coins bought a wooden box large enough to sleep in sitting up. Air was scarce, privacy non-existent, and sanitation forgotten. These buildings, with their maze-like interiors, were worlds unto themselves. Shifting populations of beggars, prostitutes, sailors, and vagrants, who came and went by the hour. The walls absorbed everything, the laughter, the sobbing, the muffled sounds of violence. Even the respectable houses, those belonging to the lower middle class, were not immune to the darkness that seeped through the city. Their design encouraged concealment. Rear staircases allowed servants to move unseen. Heavy drapes blocked both light and the gaze of neighbours. Separate parlours for men and women maintained propriety, but also bred silence. The obsession with privacy, a cornerstone of Victorian virtue, meant that what happened behind closed doors stayed there, often at terrible cost. Architectural manuals of the time emphasized moral design. A well-ordered house, it was said, reflected a well-ordered mind. The drawing room was the stage for civility, the nursery a place of discipline, the basement a realm for servants, invisible and silent. Every wall served a social function. But when poverty forced dozens into a space built for 5, these moral boundaries collapsed. The result was not just overcrowding but confusion, of class, of identity, of moral standing. In such conditions, crime did not feel like intrusion. It felt like adaptation. Labyrinthine layouts became literal traps. Lodging houses with twisting corridors and blind staircases provided cover for thieves and murderers alike. Police, unfamiliar with the terrain, hesitated to pursue suspects into these interiors. Many crimes went unreported, unrecorded, unseen. The architecture did not merely shelter the poor, it conspired with their fears. Even those who lived honestly found themselves haunted by the noises that traveled through thin walls, a cough that went unanswered, a door that creaked open in the night, a cry that no one dared to acknowledge. It was said that in some tenements, one could walk from cellar to attic without ever stepping into daylight. Narrow inner courtyards trapped foul air and amplified every whisper. The walls sweated with damp, the ceilings dripped with condensation. The combination of decay and human closeness created an atmosphere both physical and psychological, oppressive, airless, inescapable. Those who spent years in such surroundings began to see the rooms themselves as alive, watching, listening, waiting, and perhaps in a sense they were. The Victorians, for all their faith in progress, were deeply superstitious about their domestic spaces. Curtains were drawn to keep out the gaze of the street, but also to keep something else in, the memory of those who had died there. Houses were rarely demolished, they were repurposed, re-inhabited, relayered with history. A single address might host generations of different tenants, each leaving traces of their lives behind. The air of certain rooms grew heavy, not with spirits, but with the residue of human struggle. In wealthier districts, the architecture's secrecy took another form. Townhouses along Bloomsbury or Kensington were designed with multiple doors and staircases, allowing movement without intersection. Servants could pass unseen while the family entertained. Wives could retire unseen while their husbands met guests or mistresses. Respectability was a performance, and the house was its stage. But performances require concealment, and concealment breeds silence. It was within such silences that fear took root. The architecture of fear was not intentional. It was the unplanned consequence of a society that built walls to divide rather than connect. Every layer of plaster, every shuttered window, every locked door became a metaphor for the Victorian mind, orderly on the surface, but seething underneath. The more people hid, the more they feared discovery, and fear in those narrow rooms had nowhere to go but inward. By the 1870s, as crime rates rose and sensational stories filled the newspapers, architects and reformers began to speak of moral ventilation. The idea that bad housing did not merely produce bad health, but bad behavior. The layout of a room, they believed, could shape the soul of its inhabitants. Yet by then the damage was done. The city's design had already written its own narrative, a geography of shadows, where every alley led to another secret, and every house contained a history no one wished to revisit. The darkness was no longer outside the walls, it was within them, built into the very structure of London itself, and as the gaslights flickered against the damp ceilings of the East End, that darkness began to take shape in human form. The city was not just decaying, it was watching, listening, breathing, and soon it would begin to act. The darkness that once crept along the city's alleys had found its way inside. It moved behind doors and curtains, beneath embroidered cushions and the soft glow of parlour lamps. London had learned to live with its outer filth, the mud, the fog, the endless smoke of its industry, but what it could not cleanse was the quiet corruption spreading through its homes. The Victorian house, so often celebrated as the pinnacle of domestic order, became the stage upon which violence wore a mask of gentility. By the 1850s, the phrase "the Englishman's home is his castle" had entered common use, a proud declaration of privacy and ownership. But for many, the castle was not a fortress of safety, it was a cage. The boundaries that protected the family from the intrusion of the outside world also protected the abuser from scrutiny. The home became a sealed environment, where the rules of society gave way to the unspoken hierarchies of domestic life. What occurred beyond those doors was no one else's concern, not the neighbours, not the police's, not even the churches. Behind lace curtains and polished furniture, unseen battles unfolded. The Victorians had perfected the art of appearances, Every surface gleamed, every object had its place. But beneath the patterns of civility ran a deep undercurrent of control. Husbands over wives, masters over servants, parents over children. Violence did not always appear as blood or bruises. Sometimes it was silence, or hunger, or the slow suffocation of will. For women, particularly those of the lower and middle classes, the home could be both sanctuary and prison. Marriage offered stability in a society that gave women little legal independence, but it also placed them under the absolute authority of their husbands. Until the Married Women's Property Act of 1870, everything a woman owned automatically became her husband's upon marriage: her income, her possessions, even her children. A wife who fled an abusive home risked not only poverty but public disgrace. The law, reflecting the era's moral code, sided with order over justice. Many of the period's most infamous domestic crimes were not acts of sudden madness, but the slow, inevitable consequences of confinement. Newspapers reported them in a tone both horrified and fascinated: the respectable mother who poisoned her children, the governess who drowned herself in the Thames, the servant who turned upon her employer. Each case was treated as an anomaly, a shocking deviation from Victorian virtue. Yet taken together, they revealed something systemic: that the very structure of domestic life, its secrecy, its isolation, its strict hierarchies, created the conditions in which despair could curdle into violence. The servants, who moved like shadows through the households of London, lived perpetually on the threshold between visibility and erasure. Their quarters were small, often windowless, tucked beneath staircases or above kitchens. They rose before dawn, slept after midnight, and spoke only when spoken to. They knew every creak of the house, every routine, every hidden drawer, yet they themselves were expected to leave no trace. The housemaid's silence was considered part of her virtue. But silence has a way of distorting what it contains. The longer it endures, the more it warps. Many servant murders, of masters, mistresses, or fellow servants, emerged from this pressure of invisibility. The crime of Sarah Metyard and her daughter, who tortured an apprentice in their workhouse to death in 1762, still haunted Victorian imaginations. Later cases, like that of Kate Webster in 1879, a servant who killed and dismembered her employer, Mrs. Thomas, brought the terror closer to home. The newspapers described these women as monsters, yet their crimes were born of the same architecture of fear that had shaped their lives. When a human being is rendered invisible for long enough, the act of violence becomes, in their own mind, a form of revelation. For the middle-class matron, the domestic world offered its own varieties of imprisonment. The ideal Victorian woman, passive, nurturing, self-sacrificing, lived within a web of expectations so dense that any deviation was seen as moral failure. Emotional distress, postpartum depression, or chronic illness were dismissed as hysteria, to be treated by isolation, cold baths, or silence. Some women internalized the darkness, others turned it outward. The annals of the Old Bailey record countless cases of quiet deaths, poisonings, drownings, accidental falls, where the line between victim and perpetrator blurred. Even in affluent homes, the tension between appearance and reality could become unbearable. Dr. Henry Wainwright, a respectable tradesman from Whitechapel, maintained the image of a devoted husband and father while secretly keeping a mistress and two separate households. When his double life collapsed, he murdered his mistress and hid her dismembered remains beneath his business premises. His trial in 1875 shocked London not because of the crime's brutality, but because it occurred within the supposedly moral confines of the domestic sphere. The newspapers dubbed him the gentleman murderer, a title that captured the age's fascination with the collision of respectability and horror. The architecture of the Victorian home aided this duality. Heavy drapes absorbed noise. Locked interior doors created zones of privacy that were rarely breached. Neighbors might see a family at church each Sunday, smiling and composed, unaware of the nightly terror that unfolded just beyond the drawn blinds. In poorer districts, tenement walls were so thin that violence became a kind of communal rhythm. a sound everyone heard, but no one interrupted. The city had grown accustomed to noise, and silence had become the greater danger. The moral panic of the 1880s, inflamed by sensational journalism, turned these domestic horrors into entertainment. Illustrated newspapers like the Illustrated Police News published lurid sketches of crime scenes. A woman's shadowed figure at the window, a toppled lamp, a pool of black ink that was not ink. The public devoured these images with equal parts disgust and fascination. They read them not as cautionary tales but as mirrors, reflections of their own suppressed fears. The more they condemned the monsters within their midst, the more they acknowledged unconsciously that the monsters were themselves. By the late Victorian era, reformers began to speak of the disease of domestic secrecy. Charitable organizations campaigned for better housing, legal protections for women, and inspections of lodging houses. But change came slowly. For every reform, another tragedy unfolded unnoticed. A servant vanished, a wife took ill, a child was buried quietly in an overcrowded parish yard. The city's streets might have grown safer under the new police, but inside the homes, the shadows moved freely. And so, as the lamps dimmed each evening across London, the city withdrew into itself. The factories fell silent, the carriages slowed, and behind 1,000 lace curtains, the same small dramas began to play out. A whisper, a sob, a sudden silence. The kind of sound that once heard is never entirely forgotten, and beyond those private walls, the city still waited, patient, watchful, and ready to absorb whatever the homes could no longer contain. As the gaslights of London dimmed each night, and the city's noise dissolved into mist, another kind of illumination began to spread, not from the lamps of the street, but from the flickering imagination of the printed word. The murder that once hid behind lace curtains now lived on the page, reproduced, dramatized, and endlessly reinterpreted. Crime once confined to the whispers of neighbors or the solemn reports of coroners had become entertainment. The mid-19th century was the great age of the press. Industrial printing presses, powered by steam and precision engineering, allowed newspapers to multiply overnight. Literacy rates rose, postage grew cheaper, and for the first time, news traveled faster than rumor. The press became the pulse of modern life, quick, insatiable, and everywhere. Yet amid political reports and factory news, nothing sold more reliably than murder. It began modestly, with the cheap broadsides of the early 1800s, printed on single sheets and sold for a penny or two. They offered lurid accounts of local crimes, often accompanied by crude woodcut illustrations. These were not just reports, they were performances of fear and morality. The murderer's confession was frequently reconstructed by the printer, complete with warnings to the reader. The public devoured them eagerly, not because they sought justice, but because they sought sensation. Death, reproduced on paper, was safely thrilling. By the 1840s, this hunger had found its purest form in what became known as penny dreadfuls, cheap serialized tales of murder, mystery, and supernatural horror. Printed weekly and sold for a penny, they reached the hands of clerks, apprentices, and factory boys who could not afford the refined novels of the upper class. Titles like Varney the Vampire and The String of Pearls, which introduced the character of Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, turned urban violence into Gothic spectacle. The line between journalism and fiction blurred. Readers could not always tell where the truth ended and invention began, and often they did not care. The respectable press looked on with both disdain and envy. The Times, the Morning Chronicle, and other serious newspapers denounced penny dreadfuls for corrupting the morals of the young. But soon they too discovered that crime sold. The introduction of the Illustrated Police News in 1864 transformed the landscape entirely. Combining real criminal cases with melodramatic engravings, it turned ordinary events into visual theatre. Each issue presented scenes of terror, policemen bursting through doors, trembling wives confronting their murderous husbands, or the condemned standing beneath the gallows. The drawings exaggerated every emotion, fear, shock, grief, so that readers could feel what they would never dare to witness. For the first time, murder entered the parlor. The paper left folded on the breakfast table brought the horrors of the slum into the drawing rooms of the middle class. Housewives read of dismembered bodies while tending to tea. Clerks followed trials with the same excitement they once reserved for political scandals, and children, forbidden to read the dreadfuls, often did so in secret, trading torn pages behind schoolhouses or in factory yards. This new relationship between crime and print changed more than reading habits. It reshaped collective imagination. The murderer, once an object of public disgust, became a figure of fascination, almost mythic. The press gave him a story, a face, a motive, even a twisted form of logic. He was no longer merely wicked. He was complex, intelligent, sometimes pitiable. The act of killing became a narrative, and the killer, a protagonist. The homes where these murders occurred became characters too. The terraced house on a quiet street, the shabby lodging room with the locked trunk, the cellar with its lingering smell of lime. Each was recreated in print until readers could almost see them, smell them, inhabit them. London itself became a vast stage for moral drama. Every alley, every doorway, every curtained window seemed to hold potential tragedy. Even those who had never set foot in the East End could imagine its darkness because they had already read about it. Illustration intensified this intimacy. Advances in wood engraving and later lithography made images cheaper to produce and more striking. Scenes of murder could now be depicted in detail: the overturned chair, the fallen candle, the shadow at the window. Readers absorbed these pictures as though they were photographs, mistaking artistic exaggeration for truth. When the Illustrated Police News published an image of a domestic murder in Islington, copies sold out within hours. The public wanted to see, and seeing became its own form of participation. The phenomenon disturbed many social commentators. They argued that the sensational press was eroding the moral fabric of society, feeding curiosity where compassion should be. But others saw it differently. In an era when most crime victims were poor, forgotten, or buried without record, the press, even in its grotesque exaggeration, gave them visibility. The murdered servant, the abused wife, the child found in a ditch, they all became part of a collective memory. Their names, otherwise lost, were printed and circulated. The horror was not just consumed, it was remembered. Charles Dickens, ever observant of the city's contradictions, understood this paradox. In his novels, he captured both the cruelty of real urban life and the public's obsession with its dramatization. His early work, Oliver Twist, drew directly from the language of the penny dreadful, yet twisted it into moral critique. In later years, Dickens himself condemned the sensational press, calling it literature of blood, but he also knew it was unstoppable. The Victorian mind, shaped by repression and decorum, required an outlet for its fascination with the forbidden. The press simply supplied it, daily, cheaply, endlessly. By the 1880s, with the rise of mass circulation newspapers like Lloyd's Weekly and Reynolds' newspaper, murder had become a national pastime. The serialized trial, the illustrated courtroom, the public execution, all were consumed as serialized drama. Readers followed cases as they might follow a long novel, week by week, column by column. When the execution came, they felt a strange closure, as though a fictional story had reached its end. But unlike fiction, the real city offered no resolution. Another death, another discovery, another edition was always waiting. The press had not merely reflected London's darkness, it had amplified it. The city now lived within its own echo chamber, where fear, fascination, and imagination blurred into one continuous murmur. The murder houses of the East End, the slums of Clerkenwell, the back rooms of Kensington, all became part of a collective geography of dread. To read about them was to walk their corridors in one's mind. And so, even as the night deepened, London never truly grew silent. The presses kept turning, the ink kept drying, and by morning the city would awaken to another story of blood on the breakfast table. Another whisper from the dark alleys that stretched not through streets, but through the printed page itself. By the middle of the 19th century, the public's fascination with murder had evolved into something deeper, something architectural. Londoners no longer imagined violence as a sudden act in the dark streets or distant rookeries. They imagined it as something that lingered soaked into wallpaper and floorboards, held captive in rooms that refused to forget. The city's houses began to acquire reputations, whispered histories that stretched far beyond the crimes committed within them. The newspapers, of course, encouraged this transformation. Each sensational headline tied death to a specific address, fixing it in the geography of collective fear. These were not imagined settings, they were real homes on real streets, places one might pass on the way to market or church. Their ordinariness made them more terrible. The murder house was not a ruin or a castle, it was a residence, tidy and domestic, a mirror of countless others. And that was precisely why it unsettled so deeply. The first of these to truly capture the public imagination was the case later known as the Bermondsey Horror. It began in August 1854, in a small house at 3 Miniver Place, Bermondsey, a modest street in a district of narrow lanes and low, damp houses. The occupants were Frederick and Marie Manning, a married couple, and their acquaintance Patrick O'Connor, a customs officer known for carrying considerable savings in cash. When O'Connor vanished, suspicion grew, and soon neighbors noticed an odor, a sweet, clinging stench rising from beneath the kitchen flagstones. Police excavated the floor and found his body buried in quicklime, his skull fractured by repeated blows. The Mannings had already fled, each in opposite directions, but both were caught and tried at the Old Bailey. Their execution drew thousands of spectators, including a young Charles Dickens, who wrote that the crowd was a sight so inconceivably awful as to make a thoughtful man wretched forever after. But it was not merely the crime that horrified the public, it was the setting. The little kitchen, with its low ceiling and narrow door, seemed to embody the suffocation of domestic life turned rancid. Visitors who later passed through Bermondsey reported feeling a strange chill when they neared the house, though it looked no different from the others. For months the story lingered not in courtrooms but in parlours, retold as a warning, a rumour, a grim fascination. The idea took root that certain houses could remember. 6 years later, another address entered that same haunted geography. This time it was not London, but the quiet Wiltshire village of Road, later spelled Road. There stood Road Hill House, a solid Georgian structure of pale stone, surrounded by gardens and fields. It was the home of Samuel Kent, a government inspector, his second wife Mary, and their children. It was by all appearances a household of comfort and propriety, until the morning of the 30th of June 1860, when the body of 3-year-old Saville Kent was found hidden in an outdoor privy, his throat cut with a razor. The murder tore through the fragile fabric of Victorian domestic ideals. There was no burglar, no intruder. The crime had been committed by someone within the household. The investigation that followed was a public spectacle, detectives, journalists, and even amateur sleuths converging on the tranquil village. Every room of the house was examined, every family member questioned. The shutters, the nursery windows, the very layout of the hallways became clues. The press reported each detail with breathless precision. The Times published diagrams of the house, pamphlets circulated with floor plans and photographs. Readers across Britain studied these images, tracing the positions of rooms, imagining the child's final moments. The private home had become a public crime scene. Even those who had never been to Wiltshire felt they knew its corridors. The architecture of Road Hill House had been transformed into narrative, the walls themselves part of the mystery. When years later, the family's former nursemaid Constance Kent confessed to the murder, the revelation did little to quiet the fascination. The confession raised more questions than it answered: why she had done it, what tensions had existed in that house, what silences had curdled into violence. The case inspired Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone 1868, often cited as the first true detective novel. The fictional house in Collins's story, with its secret doors and repressed emotions, echoed the very atmosphere of Road Hill. The boundaries between fact and fiction dissolved completely. These early murder houses revealed a pattern that would define Victorian fear. Violence was no longer an external invasion. It was an eruption from within. The homes that symbolized stability and virtue now concealed horror. And because these houses remained standing, they became silent memorials, spaces where architecture and memory fused. The notion spread that certain bricks absorbed human emotion, that wood could hold the echo of suffering. Visitors to Road Hill and Bermondsey described a heaviness in the air, as though the rooms themselves disapproved of intrusion. By the 1870s, London's neighbourhoods were littered with such places. Each had its legend: the house in Stepney, where a woman was found bricked behind a wall; the Camden lodging, where a sailor vanished without trace; the West End rooms, where a gentleman poisoned his lover and calmly went to the theatre. Some of these stories were true, others exaggerated, but all shared the same spatial logic. The walls confined not only bodies but secrets. The tighter the architecture, the more pressure it contained. For reformers, these cases illustrated the moral dangers of overcrowding and secrecy. For the public, they became a kind of folklore, urban myths with addresses. People spoke of unlucky houses, places where no tenants stayed long, where curtains always seemed to remain drawn. And yet, curiosity persisted. Some even visited the scenes of famous crimes, walking slowly past the facades, staring at the windows as though expecting the past to reappear there. The fascination with murder houses revealed something profound about Victorian culture, an emerging awareness of psychological space. The idea that the environment could influence behavior, that rooms could shape the mind, gained traction in both literature and science. The house was no longer neutral. It was an active participant in the lives of its occupants. When violence occurred, the building itself seemed implicated, as though it had failed in its moral duty to contain order. In this way, architecture and crime became inseparable. The lines of a staircase, the depth of a cellar, the isolation of an upper room, all could become accomplices. And as these stories multiplied, they began to form a map of dread across the city and beyond. Londoners no longer walked past their neighbours' doors with indifference. Each threshold was a question, each window a possible witness. The notion of the murder house had taken hold, an idea that would persist long after the real buildings had been torn down. It was not about the people who lived there, but about the lingering memory of what had happened within. The Victorians, for all their confidence in progress, began to suspect that some places could never be truly clean again. And as the century moved forward, that suspicion grew. For the city was still expanding, and with each new street and terrace, new walls were rising, ready to watch, to listen, and to remember. By the late 1850s, London had grown accustomed to its own unease. The gas-lit alleys still glistened after rain, and the houses that had once been the scenes of unthinkable crimes now stood quietly, absorbed again into the city's fabric. Yet something had changed in the public's relationship with murder. The fascination had not faded, it had matured. The age of public executions and fevered newspaper sketches was beginning to give way to something more clinical, more inward, and in its own quiet way, far more unsettling. The Victorian mind, ever devoted to order, began to look for structure even in horror. It was no longer enough to be appalled by crime. One had to understand it, catalogue it, dissect it. Out of this impulse emerged a new kind of figure, the investigator, not the amateur sleuth of fiction or the journalist of sensation, but the trained observer of detail, moving with patience and precision through the wreckage of other people's secrets. The Metropolitan Police had been formed only a few decades earlier, in 1829, under the guidance of Sir Robert Peel. Its men, derisively nicknamed Bobbies and Peelers, were at first met with suspicion. They were seen as intrusive, their presence in private matters unwelcome. Yet, as the years passed, the growing complexity of urban life made their existence not only acceptable, but essential. In 1842, a small office was established within Scotland Yard for a select group of officers, who would work not in uniform, but in plain clothes. They were called detectives, a word that until then had no official place in English policing. These early detectives operated in a world that was both primitive and ingenious. There were no laboratories, no blood tests, no chemical fingerprinting, yet they compensated with a discipline of observation so meticulous it bordered on artistry. Every footprint, every torn scrap of fabric, every gesture of a suspect was studied as though it might contain a hidden grammar of truth. They learned to read rooms the way scholars read manuscripts, slowly, carefully, aware that meaning might be buried under layers of noise. The tools of their trade were humble: a magnifying glass, a notebook, a sense of patience. Yet, what they brought to the dark interiors of the city was something new. The idea that evidence had a voice, if one only knew how to listen. The public, once hungry for spectacle, began to find fascination in this quieter pursuit. The detective was not a man of action, but of attention, a figure who turned the drama of murder into an exercise in contemplation. By the 1860s, their methods were evolving. Photography, still a novelty, began to find its way into police work. The camera, that mechanical observer, seemed perfectly suited to the Victorian hunger for order. Scenes of crime could now be captured and studied long after the living had departed. The dead could be preserved, not only in memory, but in light. Slowly, methodically, the line between art and evidence began to blur. And then there was the growing field of forensic science, still uncertain, still experimental, yet already transforming the way truth was conceived. Physicians like Thomas Stevenson and Alfred Swain Taylor were pioneering toxicology, identifying traces of arsenic, strychnine, and laudanum in bodies where death might otherwise have seemed natural. Their lectures drew large audiences. In them, the anatomy of crime became a kind of morbid education, an invitation to marvel at the precision of decay. In 1858, long before fingerprinting became a formal tool, a Scottish physician named Henry Faulds began to notice that the ridges on fingertips were unique and unchanging. Years later, Francis Galton, cousin of Charles Darwin, would systematize this observation, creating charts and classification systems that turned individuality into pattern. It would take time before fingerprints were used officially in Britain, but the intellectual groundwork was already forming, the belief that the human body itself could testify. To the Victorians, these discoveries were both thrilling and deeply unsettling. They suggested that no act could truly be hidden, that even the smallest particle might bear witness. The crime scene, once a place of chaos and emotion, was being reimagined as a kind of archive, a repository of silent facts waiting to be read. The investigator, then, was not merely a pursuer of criminals, but a reader of environments, trained to translate what the inanimate world had seen. Literature, always quick to mirror cultural obsessions, began to reflect this transformation. Writers like Edgar Allan Poe, Charles Dickens, and Wilkie Collins turned their attention to the psychology of detection. Their protagonists were not heroic adventurers, but patient men of logic, wandering through rooms thick with atmosphere, pausing to notice a misplaced glove or a candle stub burned unevenly. These details, so minor as to be invisible to others, became the keys to entire mysteries. In these stories, observation itself was elevated to an act of creation, a way of making meaning out of disorder. But in reality, the work was slower, less dramatic. Detectives moved through rooms where the air still smelled of smoke or blood, where clocks had stopped at peculiar hours. They took statements from servants who stammered and neighbors who guessed. They walked through fog that softened every edge of the city and returned to their desks with shoes damp from rain. In their notebooks, the handwriting was cramped and neat, each line a fragment of a story that would never be fully known. It was in these quiet procedures that the moral tone of investigation began to take shape. Unlike the journalists who pursued sensation, the detectives seemed almost monastic in their restraint. They did not seek to excite, but to explain. They belonged to a new kind of order, one that replaced public horror with private scrutiny. In this way, The act of investigation became a reflection of the broader Victorian temperament, its desire to tame the irrational, to catalogue the unclean, to make even death conform to systems of logic. Yet beneath this pursuit of rationality, something older persisted, a fascination not with justice, but with observation itself. The same citizens who read reports of murder with trembling fascination now devoured every detail of police investigation. They imagined themselves as observers, peering over the shoulders of detectives, savoring each small revelation. The boundary between investigator and spectator began to blur. The public, in its own way, became a participant in the act of detection. By the 1880s, this culture of observation had reshaped London's relationship with crime. The labyrinthine streets and shadowed interiors that once seemed unknowable were now viewed as texts to be read and deciphered. Yet, the more the city was studied, the more inscrutable it became. Each solved case revealed deeper complexities, the instability of memory, the ambiguity of evidence, the strange intimacy between crime and its recorders. And so in this period of method and discipline, the murder house evolved once more. It was no longer only a site of horror or secrecy, but a space of inquiry, a laboratory of human motive. The thrill of blood had given way to the stillness of observation. The detectives and their quiet instruments had replaced the executioner and his crowd. The city, it seemed, had learned to look inward, but this calm was temporary. The discipline of detection would soon meet its greatest test, a series of crimes so brutal, so elusive, that even the most meticulous observers would find themselves staring into the abyss of their own methods. The investigator's age of order and logic had not calmed the public's imagination. If anything, it had intensified it. For every fingerprint classified, every testimony recorded in an evidence book, there was a growing realization that violence did not reside only in the dark corners of the city. It could thrive in the ordinary, in the parlor, in the bedroom, in the cellar, where coal dust clung to the walls. The very architecture of domestic life had become charged with unease. The Victorian home, once idealized as a fortress of morality, now appeared porous. Curtains no longer seemed merely decorative. They were potential veils for secrecy. Staircases that once symbolized graceful ascent between private and public spaces now carried whispers of descent, down to basements, to servants' quarters, to the hidden architecture of the house itself. The fear of the street, so vivid in the early century, had quietly shifted indoors. Much of this transformation was owed to the press. By the 1870s, illustrated newspapers had mastered the art of depicting crime scenes with a peculiar mixture of precision and suggestion. The illustrated police news, in particular, became notorious for its woodcut engravings. Images of narrow hallways, overturned furniture, women in disarray, policemen holding lanterns to half-lit rooms. These prints were not merely reports, they were performances. The public consumed them with a strange combination of horror and comfort. They made terror legible. The spectacle of the ordinary was seductive because it blurred boundaries. When readers saw the etching of a staircase or a small kitchen table, they were seeing versions of their own homes. The horror was no longer confined to places one could avoid, the rookeries, the opium dens, the docks. It had entered the familiar geography of daily life. And in this quiet intrusion, the Victorian imagination found something it could not easily exercise. Even the architecture of the time reflected this growing duality. Terraced houses stretched in endless rows, their facades uniform, respectable, anonymous. Behind each identical door lay a private world, sometimes tranquil, sometimes suffocating. To the reformer, these homes represented the triumph of order. To the novelist, they were perfect laboratories of repression. The very sameness of the streets became uncanny. How many identical windows, one after another, might conceal something unspeakable? Writers and moralists began to comment on this creeping domestic dread. The social purity movements, formed to address vice and immorality, spoke frequently of hidden sin, a phrase that resonated not only spiritually, but architecturally. The idea that every home might harbor a secret, that beneath every polished surface there might be decay, became a cultural motif. It echoed through sermons, novels, and gossip alike. And indeed, the real crimes of the era reinforced this anxiety. Newspapers chronicled case after case, in which murder had been planned not in the wilderness or the alley, but in parlors lined with patterned wallpaper. A woman poisoned her husband's tea at breakfast. A maid smothered an infant to silence its cries. A gentleman concealed his mistress's death behind the locked door of a lodging house. These were not the monstrous acts of strangers, but the intimate betrayals of proximity. Every detail of the domestic interior seemed capable of transformation. The hearth, symbol of warmth, could become an instrument of concealment, its ashes stirred to hide evidence. The bedroom, a space of rest, could become the stage for sudden violence. Even the household staircase, a space of transition, acquired an almost gothic character in the public imagination. Countless murders, both fictional and real, seemed to occur upon its steps, as though the very act of moving between floors invited danger. It was not only the physical house that became suspect, but the rituals that took place within it. Victorian etiquette prized privacy, the closing of doors, the soft muting of noise. Yet those same conventions created the conditions for secrecy. Servants were expected to remain invisible, to appear and vanish without sound. Women were encouraged to stay within domestic confines. The architecture of morality and the architecture of murder, it seemed, shared the same blueprint. The fascination with these ordinary horrors gave rise to a peculiar form of urban tourism. People would travel to the addresses of infamous crimes, lingering outside the facades, as though proximity might yield revelation. Newspapers encouraged this practice, printing the precise locations of tragedies. It was not uncommon to find small groups gathered at the site of a recent killing, gazing silently at a door or window as though it might speak. The city had become a gallery of the uncanny, a place where history clung to bricks and shadows. This new form of spectatorship was quiet but pervasive. It changed the way people saw their surroundings. A dark patch on wallpaper, a stain on a floorboard, a window left open at night, all became potential signs, fragments of invisible dramas. The city's architecture seemed to develop a second life, one visible only to the anxious imagination. Artists and writers captured this transformation in subtle ways. Painters such as Gustave Doré depicted London as a landscape of endless repetition, rows of windows glowing faintly in fog, figures half seen through glass, light and shadow interwoven. The effect was not of chaos, but of suffocation. The familiar was becoming foreign, the domestic untrustworthy. In fiction too, this unease deepened. The stories of Wilkie Collins, Mary Elizabeth Braddon, and later Arthur Conan Doyle often began not in the wilderness, but at the breakfast table, in drawing rooms, in houses that looked very much like those of their readers. The crime no longer disrupted daily life, it emerged naturally from it. The ordinary itself was the spectacle. And so, by the 1880s, Victorian England had created something entirely new, a culture that feared the familiar. It was a quiet fear, not the kind that sends crowds running, but the kind that lingers in silence, that turns a creaking floorboard into a whisper of guilt. The murder house had become symbolic not only of individual violence, but of a collective psychological state. Even the most well-lit corridors seemed capable of deceit. And every passerby who paused at a curtained window, wondering what lay behind it, was in some small way part of the same performance, the endless theatre of the ordinary. As the century deepened and the fog over London thickened, a new kind of curiosity took hold, colder, quieter, and far more ambitious than the feverish gossip of newspapers. If the ordinary world could harbour such terrors, if polite homes could conceal monstrous acts, then the question emerged, what kind of mind could live so comfortably beside civility, and yet move with such precision into cruelty? The Victorians, with their faith in progress and classification, believed that even darkness might be measured, that evil, like any natural phenomenon, could be charted, catalogued, and understood. This faith gave birth to what was sometimes called the science of character. Its earliest roots lay in the speculative disciplines of the previous century: phrenology, physiognomy, and moral anatomy. But by the 1850s, these ideas had hardened into a strange kind of certainty. The shape of a man's skull, the angle of his jaw, the depth of his eyes, all were believed to reveal something of the soul within. What religion had once called sin, science now called degeneracy. In countless drawing rooms, lectures, and penny pamphlets, the heads of criminals were measured, sketched, and displayed like specimens. A generation of readers learned to see the world in profiles and proportions. The broad forehead suggested intellect, the heavy brow, instinct, the narrow chin, weakness, the protruding jaw, brutality. It was a language of bone, an alphabet of suspicion. Even the act of looking became diagnostic. Phrenology, the mapping of the skull to reveal mental faculties, had begun as a fashionable parlor pursuit in the early century, popularized by the Viennese physician Franz Joseph Gall and his British disciple George Combe. By the time of Victoria's reign, its early optimism had curdled into something darker. Phrenological societies still operated in London, Edinburgh, and Liverpool, but their attention had turned from education to crime. Their diagrams, once meant to encourage self-improvement, were now used to identify predispositions to violence, deceit, and vice. In the dim light of lecture halls, audiences were shown plaster casts of executed murderers. The contours of these casts were traced with long wooden pointers, while lecturers spoke of organs of destructiveness and regions of secretiveness. The body of the criminal, dissected and diagrammed, became an object of public education, a lesson in the anatomy of sin. The police and courts, eager for any tool that might tame the chaos of crime, began to take interest in such theories. The line between pseudoscience and early criminology blurred. In France, the work of César Lombroso, published in the 1870s, brought a new kind of authority to these speculations. Lombroso claimed that certain men were born criminals, evolutionary throwbacks marked by physical stigmata, sloping foreheads, asymmetrical faces, abnormally long arms. His book, L'uomo delinquente, The Criminal Man, became influential across Europe, its pages filled with photographs, measurements, and comparative charts. To the Victorian imagination, this was a revelation. Evil, once moral and metaphysical, could now be made visible. The murderer was no longer merely wicked. He was defective, a product of heredity, biology, and misfortune. The theory promised to restore order, to separate the monstrous from the moral by the clear lines of science. Yet this new clarity brought with it a subtle horror. If wickedness could be read in the body, then no one was truly safe from suspicion. The language of the laboratory seeped into the street. The faces of the poor, the deformed, the foreign, all were subject to silent diagnosis. Every feature might be a sign of hidden danger. The city itself became an enormous experiment in observation. Photography, that other great Victorian obsession, became a partner in this pursuit. In police stations, offenders were made to stand still beneath harsh light as their portraits were taken, the first mugshots. These images, neatly numbered and filed, created a new kind of archive, a visual taxonomy of transgression. In their stillness, these faces seemed to confess nothing and everything at once. They were mirrors of the collective fear that the boundaries between normal and abnormal were perilously thin. The fascination extended to habits, gestures, and even handwriting. Early criminologists compiled notebooks filled with samples of script from prisoners, convinced that moral character could be traced in the slope of letters or the pressure of the pen. Others measured gait, posture, and pulse rate. The criminal was no longer merely a wrongdoer. He was a specimen, a living text to be read and interpreted. In this climate of analytical fervor, even death was made to yield its lessons. The post-mortem examination became a ritual of revelation, not of justice but of understanding. The pathologist's report read like scripture for a secular age. Veins, organs, and tissues became evidence of moral decay. The autopsy table replaced the confessional. And yet, behind the calm precision of these studies, something irrational persisted. For every diagram that claimed to isolate vice, there was a whisper of fascination, a sense that the darkness being measured was also being admired. Museums and exhibitions displayed casts and photographs of famous murderers beside ethnographic curiosities, as though crime itself were a branch of natural history. The boundary between science and spectacle grew porous. Visitors lingered, staring at the preserved skulls of those who had killed, tracing the indentations where destructiveness was said to reside. By the 1880s, the great paradox of the age had emerged. The Victorians sought to explain away evil by measurement, but the very act of studying it made it more visible, more tangible, more alive in the public mind. The attempt to rationalize fear became a new form of obsession. The science of darkness, for all its instruments and theories, was still haunted by the same fascination that had once drawn crowds to the gallows. Only now the spectacle had moved indoors, into laboratories, lecture halls, and the pages of medical journals. The scientists of crime became, in their own way, the successors of the sensational press. They replaced blood with data, horror with taxonomy, yet the underlying impulse remained unchanged, to gaze upon evil and find within it a pattern that might explain the self. The city's darkness had become interior, not only in its houses but in its minds. And as the century waned, that gaze would turn once more toward the streets, to a series of killings that seemed to defy every diagram, every chart, every rational explanation. The instruments of science would fall silent before the sheer incomprehensibility of what was to come. By the autumn of 1888, the centuries-long experiment with fear reached its inevitable conclusion. The new science had promised to map darkness, to measure and predict it, but in the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, all those instruments failed. What remained was the old terror, wordless, intimate, and absolute. The newspapers called him Jack. The name was a grim jest, a mask made of ink. Beneath it, there was only absence, no face, no arrest, no motive. Yet his presence became everywhere at once, in the headlines, the whispers, the tremor of footsteps on wet stones. Whitechapel, a district already burdened with poverty and decay, became the stage upon which the Victorian conscience performed its most dreadful play. The murders were not remarkable for their brutality. There had been worse, but for their setting. These crimes unfolded not in the wild corners of empire, nor in the shadowed countryside, but in the heart of the capital itself. Within walking distance of the city's new glass offices and gas-lit theatres, the empire's underbelly lay exposed. The geography of horror had changed. Whitechapel's streets were narrow and uneven, lined with lodging houses where the destitute paid by the night. Gaslight pooled in weak circles, leaving long corridors of shadow between them. The air carried the smells of soot, blood, gin, and rain. The fog did not merely descend, it gathered, like memory itself, thick, persistent, and intimate. The murders unfolded across this landscape with a terrible rhythm. Bucks Row, Harnbury Street, Burner Street, Mitre Square, Miller's Court. Each name became a marker, a punctuation in a story the city could not stop telling. Crowds gathered after each killing, but what they looked at was more than blood. They saw the failure of progress, the cracks in the facade of civilization, the home, the science, the order of things, all mocked by the precision of the unseen hand that moved through the fog. For the police, these were crimes without precedent. Detectives from Scotland Yard walked the same cobblestones where they had once investigated petty thefts and drunken fights. Now they searched for logic where none existed. The diagrams, measurements, and skull theories of Lombroso and his followers were useless here. Evil, it seemed, had no identifiable shape. Journalists filled the vacuum. The press, now a national organism, devoured every fragment. The witness statements, the medical reports, the rumors. Each headline was a shroud. Each morning paper carried the city's nightmares into breakfast parlors and railway compartments. The Ripper became a ghost that lived between type and rumor, a modern myth born in real streets. But the deeper story was not of the murderer, it was of the place. Whitechapel became more than a setting, it became a wound. The buildings, the cobblestones, even the air itself seemed to retain an echo of those nights. To walk through Dorset Street years later was to feel a kind of residue, not of fear alone, but of something quieter, heavier, remembrance. Historians would later call the Whitechapel murders the birth of the modern serial killer, but to the people who lived there, it was something more primitive, a haunting made of repetition. Each murder seemed to fold back into the one before, until time itself felt circular. The city began to watch itself. Every shadow was suspect, every stranger a possibility. The notion of privacy, once the Victorian ideal, now became a source of dread. And in the years that followed, even as the gaslights were replaced by electric bulbs, the memory persisted. Visitors spoke of a feeling, a chill that had nothing to do with weather. Buildings were demolished, rebuilt, renamed, yet, somehow, the streets refused to forget. The geography of horror had become permanent. Artists and writers would return to it endlessly. The fog, the lamplight, the figure half seen. Painters blurred the edges of faces. Novelists described the sound of footsteps dissolving into rain. Jack became less a man than an idea, the city's shadow given form. The more scholars studied him, the less they found. What remained was atmosphere, repetition, and the uneasy sense that the story was not over, only diffused into the stones. In a way, the Whitechapel murders closed the Victorian age as it had begun, with a mystery that defied reason. The century that had measured skulls and catalogued sins ended with something that refused to be known. It was as if the darkness, tired of being dissected, had simply turned inward and waited. Today the district has changed. The fog has lifted, the slaughterhouses are gone, and the streets are lit by cold electric light. Yet the name remains, Whitechapel, still spoken with the faintest trace of unease, because some places do not forget what they have seen. The cobblestones remember, the walls remember, and the silence that follows every passing footstep still carries, almost imperceptibly, the echo of a century's fear. After the gaslights dimmed and the crowds dispersed, the city returned to its quieter rhythm, the soft repetitive labor of survival. Yet, in every household, every narrow street, there was a presence that could not be dismissed. It was not the memory of the murderer, but of those who had lived their lives beneath his shadow. In Victorian London, women formed the architecture of the unseen. They were everywhere, in kitchens, factories, workhouses, and the cramped attic rooms above shops, and yet they were seldom visible in the record. Their hands scrubbed, stitched, cooked and comforted, their names faded quickly into ledgers, death certificates, and census lists. They existed in motion, part of the city's machinery, and yet entirely disposable within it. For the servant girl, the city was both opportunity and trap. London in the 19th century absorbed thousands of young women from rural villages, each seeking work in the homes of the prosperous. They arrived by train or cart, carrying little more than a change of clothes and a letter of recommendation. Their new lives were dictated by the rhythms of other people's households, the creak of floorboards, the ringing of bells, the sound of boots on stairs. The houses themselves mirrored their hierarchies. Servants slept in small, windowless rooms at the top or bottom of the house, the margins of domestic architecture. They entered by separate doors, moved along hidden staircases, and were expected to remain silent and invisible. The Victorians built privacy into brick and wood, and with it they built isolation. Within these spaces, danger took quiet forms. Exhaustion, disease, and abuse were common, but rarely spoken of. The language of propriety made silence a form of duty. Servants who spoke against their employers risked dismissal, homelessness, or worse, the slow descent into the rookeries and lodging houses where the city's forgotten lived. For many, survival meant obedience. even when obedience meant disappearance. For working-class women outside domestic service, the dangers were of a different kind, but equally pervasive. Factories and sweatshops offered work but little safety. The hours were long, the pay meager, the air thick with dust and smoke. At night, the streets themselves became another form of workplace. Poverty blurred the line between labor and survival. For some, prostitution was the only option left. These were the women who filled the narrow alleys of Whitechapel, laundresses, charwomen, widows, and those who moved through the fog in search of warmth and coin. Their lives were ordinary, their deaths often unremarked, until one man's violence turned their anonymity into history. The newspapers named them only to strip them of meaning, reducing them to cautionary figures in a moral tale. But behind every sensational headline was a life of quiet endurance, a sequence of days filled with work, fatigue, and fear. Inside the respectable homes of the middle and upper classes, the conditions were different, but not always kinder. Wives lived within the boundaries of respectability, well-fed, well-clothed, and yet confined. The doctrine of separate spheres defined a woman's life as domestic, moral, and silent. A good wife managed her household, soothed her husband's nerves, raised her children, and concealed her discontent. To leave a marriage was to invite ruin. The law until the late 19th century offered little recourse. Property, custody, even personal freedom were bound to the husband's will. It is in these drawing rooms and parlors that the phrase House of Shadows takes on its truest form. Beneath the lace curtains and ticking clocks, an undercurrent of repression moved quietly. Many women lived their entire lives without ever walking alone through the city that surrounded them. Their fears were not of strangers in alleyways, but of tempers within walls, of hands that struck in silence, of doors that locked from the inside. Newspapers and public records rarely recorded such incidents, unless they ended in scandal or death. The middle-class home was a stage for performance, the perfect family portrait concealing private violence. The architecture of respectability demanded that appearances be maintained at all costs. It was this insistence on secrecy that made domestic murder such a fascination for the Victorian imagination. When the curtain tore, the shock was not only in the crime, but in the realization of what had always been hidden behind it. Feminist historians, looking back, have described this era as one of institutional silence. The social and legal systems worked in tandem to maintain it. Women's voices, in courts, newspapers, and even police reports, were filtered through male intermediaries. Their testimonies were often dismissed as hysteria or exaggeration. In this way, history itself conspired to erase them, leaving behind only the faint impressions of their existence. The handwriting in a ledger, the blurred face in a photograph, the brief mention in a coroner's inquest. Yet within that silence, there was endurance. The same qualities that kept women alive in the city's underbelly, resilience, adaptability, quiet cunning, became their means of resistance. Mutual aid networks formed among servants, widows shared rooms and meals, factory girls pooled their wages. Even in the worst corners of the city, solidarity flickered like candlelight. As the century drew to a close, social reformers began to take notice. Writers like Henry Mayhew and journalists like W.T. Stead documented the conditions of London's poor. Charitable institutions and women's refuges appeared, though often steeped in moral judgment. Still, a new consciousness began to form, one that recognized that the shadows of the Victorian home were not natural, but constructed. And so, while the city continued to hum with progress, new bridges, railways, electric lights, there remained this other world beneath it, populated by women whose histories were never properly told. Their absence is what gives the Victorian city its haunting quality. For every murderer's name that survives, there are hundreds of women's names that do not. Even now, when one reads the inquest reports, it is not the crimes themselves that chill the blood, but the way the victims are described, briefly, impersonally, as though they were already fading from existence. The silence surrounding them, is not just the silence of the grave, but of a society that preferred not to listen. In the end, it is that silence, more than any scream or confession, that lingers in the rooms where they once lived. It becomes part of the walls, part of the air. The House of Shadows was never just a metaphor. It was London itself, a city built on invisible labor, invisible suffering, and the long endurance of those who had no choice but to endure. By the late 19th century, London's nights glowed differently. The old oil lamps had given way to gaslight, a soft quivering luminescence that bled into fog and shimmered on wet cobblestones. It was progress, the newspapers said, a triumph of science and industry. But within the narrow rooms of the city, the new light created more than visibility. It created exposure. The gaslight hummed faintly, a low vibration that filled the silence between walls. Its shadows were soft, but never still. Curtains shifted, objects moved slightly, and faces seemed to change as the flame wavered behind the glass globe. It was a light that never fully revealed, nor entirely concealed. And in that ambiguity, an unease took root. Isolation, too, had become an unspoken condition of urban life. The more London grew, the more its inhabitants withdrew into themselves. In the polite drawing rooms of Bloomsbury, the expectation of composure was absolute. Conversation followed ritual. Emotion was discouraged, except in moderation. Even affection had to be filtered through propriety. Behind closed doors, the weight of restraint became unbearable. Wives kept diaries no one would read. Servants whispered to each other in the scullery, careful that their words did not travel upstairs. The poor, living 10 to a room, in East End lodging houses, shared space but not intimacy, each person reduced to their own small struggle for breath, warmth and coin. The city was full of voices, yet every voice seemed to echo inside its own private cell. The gaslight became a symbol of this tension. Its constant flicker mimicked consciousness, alive yet anxious. In fiction it became shorthand for paranoia and repression. The dimly lit staircase, the closed door, the shadow that shifted when no one moved. The playwright Patrick Hamilton would later capture this perfectly in Gaslight, 1938, though the roots of the term gaslighting stretch back to these Victorian sensations, the subtle distortion of reality created by isolation and flickering light. The architecture of the era amplified this mood. Narrow hallways, multiple floors, closed parlors, all designed to contain rather than connect. Respectable houses were built like moral machines. Every space had its proper function, and deviation was quietly discouraged. A misplaced object or an unannounced visitor could disturb the fragile equilibrium. In working-class dwellings, the same physical isolation took on a different form. Instead of abundance of space, there was claustrophobia. Families shared single rooms, strangers slept side by side. Privacy was a luxury, but loneliness persisted nonetheless. The constant noise, footsteps, crying infants, drunken arguments, created a paradoxical solitude. In such conditions, people learned to look inward, to retreat into thought, habit, or despair. Psychiatrists of the period began to take note of this strange new ailment of modern life. Nervous exhaustion and melancholia became common diagnoses among both men and women. For women, especially those confined to domestic roles, the symptoms were often dismissed as hysteria. Rest cures were prescribed, darkened rooms, stillness, enforced silence, treatments that mirrored the very isolation that caused the illness. The ticking clock became an emblem of this stillness. It was omnipresent in drawing rooms, servant quarters, boarding houses. Its sound measured time in a way that felt both mechanical and intimate. It reminded the inhabitants that the day was gone, the night was passing, and tomorrow would arrive exactly the same. The clock did not lie, but it offered no comfort. Writers of the age, Dickens, Gissing, Braddon, Collins, sensed this undercurrent long before psychologists gave it a name. Their characters wandered through foggy streets, or sat sleepless beside dim fires, trapped by invisible forces of duty, class and propriety. The gaslight, to them, was more than a symbol of progress. It was the visible expression of a society that refused to look directly at itself. Even in the wealthiest neighborhoods, the atmosphere of dread was not entirely absent. The late Victorian obsession with appearances bred anxiety of its own. A stain on a carpet, a servant's mistake, an overheard argument, any small imperfection might rupture the illusion of order. People learned to live carefully, to manage each gesture and word. And yet, beneath that control, emotion collected like damp beneath wallpaper, unseen but corrosive. At night, when the lamps hissed softly and the fog pressed against the glass, the illusion of security wavered. The smallest sounds, a footstep above, a door latch turning, a sudden silence, could send the imagination spiraling. Fear had become domestic. It no longer needed dark alleys or unfamiliar faces. It could thrive within one's own home, beneath one's own roof. In this psychological landscape, the boundaries between sanity and unease blurred. Ordinary life required constant self-regulation, the suppression of anger, grief, desire, and doubt. What could not be expressed outwardly turned inward, manifesting in sleeplessness, hallucinations, or quiet despair. Doctors called it nervous disease. Poets called it melancholy. The sufferers, if they spoke at all, called it nothing. The gaslight revealed just enough to make the imagination do the rest. It softened reality until everything, faces, rooms, even memories, seemed slightly uncertain. The flame swayed as if breathing. Its reflection trembled in the window pane. Alone in such a room, one might mistake one's own reflection for another presence. A trick of the glass, perhaps, or a symptom of too much solitude. By the turn of the century, as electricity began to replace gaslight, a curious nostalgia emerged. People complained that the new bulbs were too harsh, too revealing. They missed the softness of the old light, forgetting how it had once filled rooms with anxiety. In a way, the gaslight became a memory of repression itself, a glow that blurred reality enough to make life tolerable, even as it quietly suffocated it. And so the century dimmed beneath its own invention. The hum of the gas mantle faded, replaced by the steady buzz of wires, but the atmosphere it created, that uneasy balance between visibility and concealment, never fully left. Its legacy persisted in the architecture of cities, in the psychology of modern solitude, and in the stories people continued to tell about flickering lights and unseen presences. The Victorians had built a world of walls, rooms, and boundaries, and then discovered that isolation could echo louder than any noise. The city slept, but lightly. Every lamp burned with its own faint whisper. Every clock ticked toward the same question: how much silence can a house contain before it begins to speak? As the 19th century moved toward its uneasy twilight, London became a city perpetually on edge. The fog had become more than weather. It was metaphor, symbol, excuse. It concealed the things the empire preferred not to see: its poor, its women, its sins. And when those sins surfaced, through murder, scandal, or whispered rumor, the city's respectable classes reacted not with understanding, but with fear disguised as righteousness. Victorian morality was not born of serenity, but of anxiety. Beneath the sermons and social reforms lay the constant suspicion that civilization was fragile, that a single lapse of virtue might send society sliding backward into chaos. The empire had expanded across continents, but its moral boundaries were always at war with itself. It conquered lands in the name of order, while struggling to impose that same order within its own streets. Every moral panic began the same way. A crime in the papers, a rumor in the market, a preacher's voice growing shrill from the pulpit. The city responded like an organism under threat. Reform societies formed overnight, lectures were given, pamphlets printed, and parliaments debated. Yet for all their outrage, these efforts rarely touched the causes of the darkness they condemned. They treated evil as contagion rather than consequence. The mid-century brought one of the earliest of these crusades, the campaigns against vice districts and fallen women. The Society for the Suppression of Vice, founded in the early 1800s, had grown into a moral police force by the 1850s. Its members prowled theatres, gin shops and dance halls in search of immorality to prosecute. They seized obscene literature, broke up public entertainments, and lobbied for stricter laws on prostitution and publication. To them, London's salvation lay in surveillance. But surveillance, as always, saw selectively. The working-class districts, the rookeries and lodging houses, were framed as moral hazards rather than victims of poverty. Reformers described them in language both horrified and fascinated: dark, diseased, corrupt. Their concern was less for the suffering of the poor than for the contamination of the respectable. It was not hunger or abuse that frightened them, but proximity, the thought that sin might spread by contact. The church, too, found new fervor in fear. Sermons rang with images of divine retribution, the city as a modern Babylon, its towers of wealth built on foundations of vice. Religious tracts sold by the thousands, warning readers that indulgence in pleasure, even in imagination, invited destruction. The message was simple, absolute, and cruelly effective. Purity was safety, curiosity was sin. The irony, of course, was that the same society that condemned vice consumed it voraciously. The penny dreadfuls and sensational newspapers that moralists decried as corrupting influences were read by the same audiences who attended reform lectures. Respectable readers thrilled to accounts of murders, adulteries, and executions before folding their papers neatly beside the breakfast tea. Sin was tolerated so long as it was aesthetic, rendered in ink, distance, and disapproval. The contradiction deepened in the latter half of the century, when the Contagious Diseases Act sought to regulate prostitution in military towns by forcibly examining and detaining women suspected of carrying infection. The policy, justified as protection of public health and morality, exposed the hypocrisy of the age. Respectable men's desires were excused, women's bodies were punished, public virtue became a system of private cruelty. Philanthropic organizations multiplied, often funded by the same industrial fortunes that relied on exploited labor. Wealthy patrons built workhouses and orphanages, while their factories ran on the exhaustion of women and children. Charity became a kind of theater, a way to display compassion without altering the conditions that made it necessary. The poor were to be pitied, but not trusted. Help came with moral lectures, conditions, and surveillance. This was the paradox of the moral panic, a society terrified by the symptoms of its own design. Every reform campaign became a mirror held up to the empire's conscience, reflecting not the faces of sinners, but of those who needed them to exist. The underclass became the canvas upon which middle-class virtue painted itself. The darker the depiction, the brighter the self-congratulation. Yet even in the midst of these campaigns, London refused to be purified. The city absorbed every attempt to cleanse it, folding reform into routine. Slums were redeveloped, pushing the poor further east. Brothels reopened under new names. Newspapers found new crimes to condemn. The fog rolled back each morning, as though nothing had happened. By the 1880s and 1890s, the rhetoric of morality had grown almost theatrical. Public speeches warned of degeneration, the decline of the English race, the corruption of youth, the softening of men. Scientists began to speak of heredity and biological decay, giving moral fear the appearance of logic. Eugenic theories, still in their infancy, found fertile ground among those who sought order through elimination. The city, it seemed, could only define itself by identifying what to exclude. For the ordinary Londoner, moral panic became background noise, another hum in a city already filled with sermons, advertisements, and the distant hiss of gas. The reformers' voices echoed through halls and churches, but the slums remained. The rookeries were demolished, yet poverty reassembled itself elsewhere. The city was too vast, too alive, too contradictory to be cured. It was both sinner and saint, victim and judge. And as the preachers warned of divine punishment and the reformers marched for purity, the gaslights continued to burn in the same quiet rooms, where nothing truly changed. Respectable families sat before the fire, reading of sin in the papers and thanking Providence for their safety. Outside, the same wind moved through the same streets, carrying the same muffled cries. The attempt to clean the city became its own illusion, another ritual of repression, like the drawing room silence or the dimmed gas flame. Beneath the moral sermons and the laws, the darkness endured, patient and untouched. It did not need to resist, it only needed to wait. And as the century prepared to turn, the panic began to shift, from morality to memory, from the fear of sin to the fear of what sin had revealed. The fog that London had tried to banish began to feel almost comforting, a familiar veil to hide the city's reflection from itself. Some houses never let go. Long after the police tape was lifted, after the furniture was sold and the curtains drawn, something remained, not quite sound, not quite silence. The Victorians who built their homes to last discovered that permanence has its own curse, memory. Brick, plaster, wood, all are patient record keepers. Every echo, every breath, every sudden violence leaves an impression too subtle to see, too deep to name. In the decades after the great moral panics and public trials, London grew quieter. Streets once crowded with gawkers returned to stillness. The news moved on, but within the walls of certain houses, the air seemed to hold its breath. The Bermondsey House, where Maria Manning and her husband murdered their lodger, the parlour in Road Hill where a child was found, these places became silent shrines to what could not be erased. The Victorians had no need for modern horror stories, they lived among them. Each creak of a floorboard, each chill in an unused room, seemed to whisper the same unanswerable question: can a place remember? Writers of the era began to suspect that it could. Henry James, Wilkie Collins, Charles Dickens, all circled the same idea from different angles, that guilt, secrecy and loss were not buried with the dead, but absorbed by the spaces they inhabited. The haunted house was not about ghosts at all, it was about architecture as witness. Victorian houses were built to contain, to control. They divided life into compartments, drawing rooms for guests, attics for servants, cellars for storage, secrets. Privacy was both privilege and prison. And when tragedy breached those walls, the entire structure seemed to warp under the weight of what it had held. The locked nursery, the dark stairwell, the empty bed, each became a relic, a negative image of what once was. In some cases, these homes became exhibits, murder houses preserved in rumour, if not in fact. Locals avoided them. Children dared each other to touch their doors. The new tenants spoke in lowered voices, as though not to disturb the memory that slept there. The Victorians, so proud of progress, found themselves living alongside ruins of the recent past. The age of invention had given birth to an age of residue. Even their architecture seemed complicit. Gaslight flickered in corners, casting shadows that moved independently of their sources. Wallpaper patterns appeared to shift in the dim glow. Dampness rose like a ghost through the foundations. The houses breathed, expanding with heat, sighing in the cold. They were alive in the only way memory is alive, by repetition. After great crimes, some rooms were sealed. Others were left exactly as they were, as if by keeping the objects untouched, time itself might pause. The Victorians called it respect for the dead. Perhaps it was also fear of contamination, or reverence for the unexplainable. In photographs of those preserved rooms, the overturned chair, the clock stopped mid-tick, one can almost sense the invisible audience of the past, still watching. As the century advanced, the fascination with haunted houses evolved into something cultural, almost ritualistic. Mediums, seances and spiritualists began to appear, not because people truly believed the dead returned, but because the living refused to forget. Memory, when denied a language, invents one, but the deeper truth was architectural, not spectral. These houses were built with materials that aged slowly, refusing to decay at the same rate as the lives they sheltered. Stone outlasted skin, iron outlasted breath. The result was a city filled with ghosts that were not spirits but echoes, preserved in the angles of hallways. the scratches on doors, the way light pooled unevenly on the floorboards. In a sense, every Victorian home became a kind of museum, not of artifacts, but of atmospheres. They catalogued human absence with exquisite precision, and as London modernized, demolishing its old neighborhoods for railways and factories, those who lingered spoke of a strange feeling in the air, as if the city itself resisted forgetting. The haunted house was never a supernatural idea, it was a moral one. It reminded the living that history lingers, that walls remember what people prefer to erase. Each building was an archive of human contradiction, beauty and cruelty, warmth and repression, creation and loss. And so, when the Victorians spoke of ghosts, they were really speaking of architecture, of the slow endurance of space against the fragility of time. The true haunting was not a spectre at all, but the realization that the past does not vanish. It settles into corners. It hides behind doors. It waits quietly for someone to listen. While the rooms of London whispered to themselves, another kind of silence was forming, the quiet murmur of parlours where men spoke of murder over tea. In these respectable drawing rooms, the horrors of the alley became a matter of conversation rather than experience. They called themselves students of the human condition, moral philosophers, amateur criminologists. But beneath the veneer of learning, there was something unmistakably voyeuristic, the calm thrill of discussing other people's despair from a safe and carpeted distance. By the 1870s and 1880s, crime had become fashionable. It was studied, dissected, and debated as though it were a branch of natural science. Gentlemen, lawyers, physicians, journalists, even clergymen, gathered around polished tables to examine newspaper clippings, share the latest forensic theories, and speculate about motive and madness. What once belonged to the streets now belonged to salons. The world of blood and fear had been domesticated. There was comfort in abstraction. To speak of murder as a phenomenon, or a social pathology, stripped it of its sting. These men of reason believed that crime could be solved like a mathematical riddle, that every act of violence followed a logic, every criminal a pattern. It was an age obsessed with classification of plants, of species, of social types. Murder was simply another specimen to pin beneath the glass. Societies and journals began to appear, devoted to what they called criminological inquiry. They published treatises on the criminal mind, theories of heredity, and charts of physical traits said to indicate moral weakness. In the heart of London, rooms once filled with scholars of antiquity now hosted lectures on deviance and degeneration. The language was polite, the subject matter less so. Among the most curious figures were the armchair detectives, those who, inspired by real investigations, began to see themselves as participants in the great moral puzzle of crime. Newspapers encouraged this. Readers were invited to follow the clues to form their own conclusions before the next edition revealed the outcome. Detection had become a parlor game, an intellectual pastime wrapped in moral superiority. The true detectives, those working in the fog and filth of the streets, were rarely invited into these circles. Their work was practical, dirty, and uncertain. The gentlemen investigators preferred the version of crime that lived on paper, purified by distance and prose. In their hands, murder became a kind of aesthetic problem, how to balance motive and means, guilt and circumstance. The growing genre of detective fiction mirrored this fascination. Writers like Wilkie Collins and Arthur Conan Doyle elevated detection into an art form, crafting characters whose genius lay not in empathy, but in analysis. The detective was calm, rational, and male, a reflection of the Victorian gentleman himself. In these stories, the chaos of human suffering was always resolved by intellect. The mess of blood and grief was tidied into narrative order, yet behind the comfort of these fictions lurked something unresolved. The men who discussed crime so freely rarely saw the conditions that produced it. They did not smell the rotting Thames at low tide, nor hear the cough of children in the rookeries. They preferred the idea of evil to the evidence of poverty. Crime for them was not a symptom of society, but a flaw in the individual, a defect to be measured, mapped and moralized. Dinner parties became small theatres of speculation. Guests spoke of famous cases with the same tone they used for art or politics. The names of murderers became conversational currency. The more gruesome the details, the more animated the discussion, though always within the bounds of civility. A shudder, a sigh, a knowing remark about the decline of values, then coffee would be poured, and the conversation would move on. In this way, Victorian London learned to intellectualize fear. Murder lost its sting when bound in theory. The gentlemen of investigation did not seek justice, they sought understanding, or the illusion of it. They turned crime into narrative, horror into hypothesis. Their curiosity was not cruel, but it was detached, a study of shadows from the comfort of the lamp-lit room. It is tempting to dismiss them as hypocrites, yet they were products of their time, a society that worshipped progress and recoiled from its own consequences. The railways, the factories, the tenements, all symbols of advancement, had created new forms of anonymity, new pressures, new crimes. The gentlemen could not stop the machine, so they studied its casualties instead, and in doing so, they helped create something enduring. Their fascination gave birth to the institutions that would formalize criminal investigation, criminology, psychology, forensic science. The quiet curiosity of those evenings echoed forward, shaping the language of justice for centuries to come. But in the moment, in the dim parlours of 19th century London, it was simpler. Outside, fog drifted across the gas lamps. Inside, the gentlemen spoke softly of death, confident that it belonged to someone else's world. They never saw how deeply their fascination too would seep into the walls of the city, how every question asked in comfort leaves its own kind of mark. London never forgot how to echo. Even when the noise of day gave way to the hush of night, the city continued to hum in low frequencies, the faint rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestone, the drip of condensation from eaves, the soft groan of metal expanding and contracting with the chill. For those who listened, the city's sounds were a kind of memory. Every murder, every whispered panic, every rumor of footsteps in the dark left an imprint, not only on the people who lived there, but on the air itself. By the late Victorian period, London was a place of boundaries, iron fences, stone facades, brick partitions, all designed to separate order from disorder, the living from the forgotten. The city had fenced itself in. Every respectable terrace displayed its railings like armor, a declaration of property, of safety, of belonging to the world of civility. Yet behind those same black bars, light spilled in narrow ribbons across steps that were never entirely clean. Iron was both barrier and witness. At night, those railings became instruments. The wind passing through them made a soft, almost musical tone, a low vibration that carried down entire streets. When a carriage rolled by, the wheels struck a rhythm against the uneven paving stones, slow, deliberate, unchanging. The gas lamps hissed softly. Together, they created a kind of nocturne, a music of containment. In this soundscape, the city's crimes did not scream, they lingered. After each sensational case, after the spectators dispersed and the newspapers found their next scandal, the streets returned to stillness. But stillness in London was never truly silent. The same alleys that had seen policemen's lanterns and the shuffle of curious crowds now echoed only with the wind. People passing by at night might not have known what had happened there, but they felt it. The air seemed to shift, slightly heavier, as if it remembered. Sound carries differently in a place that has seen violence. The Victorians understood this instinctively, even if they could not explain it. The faint clatter of a window latch, the creak of a gate, the drip of water in a neglected courtyard. These were not just noises, but reminders. The very infrastructure of London seemed to amplify what it should have absorbed. Iron especially held resonance. It rang when struck, like a memory unwilling to fade. The new railways and telegraph lines only deepened this strange music. Vibrations travelled beneath the ground and along wires, mingling the mechanical pulse of progress with the organic heartbeat of the old city. London had become an echo chamber, a vast machine of stone and sound. Its boundaries, the railings, the grates, the bridges, served as both physical divisions and resonant membranes. The city's progress and its pain hummed through them alike. Writers and painters began to notice this acoustics of dread. In the novels of Dickens and later of Thomas Hardy, the city was not only seen but heard, the sound of footsteps following too closely, of bells tolling without cause, of silence deep enough to feel like breath. Artists of the nocturne school, like Whistler, tried to capture that same vibration through mist and color, the indistinct forms of bridges and lamps dissolving into tone. The art of the period became a kind of listening. For the working poor, sound was both comfort and warning. The clatter of boots on the pavement could mean a constable, a neighbor, or something worse. The shrill whistle of a factory, the ring of a church bell, the distant rumble of carts, all told the time of day, the rhythm of survival. When violence struck, it was sound that carried the first alarm and the last echo. A cry heard through an open window, a door slammed too quickly, the sudden absence of noise afterward, silence that grew thick and expectant. Even the fog had its sound, not silence, but the muffled distortion of everything familiar. It turned footsteps into whispers and made distance impossible to judge. Murderers, policemen, and passers-by alike moved through it as though in a dream, guided more by hearing than by sight. For those who lived through those nights, the fog was the city's breath made visible. The iron railings, so proudly polished by day, grew cold and slick by night. They framed every respectable house, every step leading up to a door painted black or green. When touched, they felt alive with the damp, metallic veins running through the city's body. Children on their way to school would run sticks along them, producing a rhythmic clatter that echoed down entire streets. That sound, cheerful by daylight, turned hollow after dark. It was easy to imagine that same noise continuing long after the child had gone, as if the railings themselves remembered the motion. As London grew, so did its echoes. The expansion of the city, new bridges, new tenements, new prisons, multiplied the surfaces that could reflect and absorb sound. The Thames, still tidal and murky, carried noise across districts like a slow conductor. Barges creaked against their moorings, chains clanked, the river whispered the same song it always had, one of carrying things away. It is perhaps impossible to live in such a city without internalizing its acoustics. The Victorians, surrounded by noise and repetition, developed a kind of selective hearing, tuning out the cries of the poor, the grind of machinery, the soft sounds of suffering that echoed between the railings. The result was a collective numbness, an urban deafness, yet the echoes persisted. They lingered in literature, in rumour, in the nervous tremor of late-night footsteps. London, the city that never truly slept, had learned to dream in sound, and so, long after the crimes faded from memory, the echoes remained, faint, continuous, reverberating through the metal and stone. Each railing still carried a note of the past. Each step on the wet pavement added another layer to the city's endless refrain. The Victorians might have built London to endure, but what endured most was not the buildings, it was the noise they left behind. London was never one city, it was several, layered one atop another like sediment, each with its own sound, smell and rhythm. The respectable world of terraces, banks and theatres rested upon another London entirely, one without maps, where the streets curled back on themselves, and the air smelled of coal, damp brick, and the faint rot of the Thames. To walk there was to enter a place that official London pretended did not exist. By the mid-19th century, social reformers, journalists, and even clergymen had begun to map these hidden districts. Whitechapel, Spitalfields, Southwark, Bethnal Green, not in the service of understanding, but of control. Their survey spoke of dens of vice, of moral darkness, of slums teeming with danger, but the maps they drew, full of black shaded blocks and grim annotations, revealed something unintended, a living city beneath the one they claimed to know. Whitechapel was perhaps the most infamous. It lay east of the city of London, where the smoke of factories and the salt of the docks mingled in the air. Its narrow courts were lined with lodging houses, taverns and workshops, where men and women stitched, hammered, and packed goods from dawn to exhaustion. Here, poverty was not an exception, it was the rule. Crime was not imported, it was grown locally, nourished by hunger and anonymity. The streets were so narrow that neighbors could speak from window to window without raising their voices. At night, those same streets closed in like corridors. Spitalfields lay adjacent, older and more mournful, once home to Huguenot weavers, later to migrants from Ireland and Eastern Europe. The elegant brick houses of the 18th century stood divided and subdivided, their attics rented to families who slept by shifts, their ground floors turned into sweatshops. The names of the streets, Fashion Fornia, Princelet, whispered of a past that had long fled westward. By gaslight, the fine Georgian facades looked hollow, their beauty surviving only as a kind of ghost. Southwark, across the river, had its own labyrinth. The borough had been a place of outsiders for centuries, home to theatres, prisons, tanneries and breweries. Its damp air was heavy with yeast and smoke, and its crooked lanes seemed perpetually half-submerged in shadow. Here, the distinction between vice and survival blurred. The docks and warehouses gave work, but also anonymity. The police patrolled, but rarely interfered. Southwark lived by its own rules, neither lawful nor lawless, but simply apart. Each of these districts formed a geography of invisibility. The Victorians, so precise in their record-keeping, could measure the weight of a coin or the distance of a railway line, but they could not map despair. When they tried, their maps became moral diagrams, lines drawn between the clean and the unclean, the worthy and the fallen. Yet the people who lived there did not see themselves as statistics or warnings. They were workers, widows, scavengers, and children. Their London was tactile, defined by the warmth of shared rooms, the smell of soup, the creak of the stair, the long silence after the last shift ended. The invisible city was also an emotional map. Fear and familiarity shared the same streets. A woman walking home might avoid certain corners, not because of what she had seen there, but because of what she had heard. A man might sleep in one lodging house for months, then vanish without notice. In this world, geography was fluid. It changed with rumour, with hunger, with the sound of a constable's boots. The line between safety and danger was not drawn on any paper. It lived in memory and instinct. Those who studied crime often mistook the map for the territory. They saw Whitechapel as a symptom, not as a place, a landscape of vice to be cleansed. But the crimes that drew their attention were exceptions. Most lives passed quietly, unrecorded, forgotten. In the mornings, women carried pails of water from pumps, men tramped to factories before the sun rose. The alleys filled with the noise of industry, saws, hammers, the call of street vendors. Even in the darkest corners, there was routine, endurance, and small kindness. The city's unseen heart was not violence, but persistence. Still, crime shaped its geography. Police patrols carved predictable routes, leaving pockets of invisibility where laws thinned. Landlords learned which streets frightened away the middle class and bought them cheaply. Charities established missions in areas the newspapers had declared beyond hope. In this way, murder and fear became instruments of urban planning, forces that rearranged the city as effectively as any architect. As the century closed, the invisible city began to shrink, not because poverty disappeared, but because the light grew brighter. Gas lamps gave way to electric bulbs, horse-drawn carts yielded to trams. The fog lifted, but the old boundaries endured in subtler forms: wages, rent, reputation. The railings that once divided classes were now invisible, internal. To walk through those same neighbourhoods today, the narrow lanes of Spitalfields, the shadowed arches of Southwark, is to walk upon that forgotten map. Some of the old street names survive, others have been erased, yet beneath the sound of traffic, one can still sense the rhythm of the old London, the measured tread of those who laboured, endured, and vanished without record. The invisible city was never truly lost, it simply learned to live within the visible one. As the 19th century drew toward its end, London began to change its relationship with its own darkness. What had once been whispered about became discussed. What had once been hidden began to be displayed. The murders that had frozen the city in fear were no longer seen merely as crimes, but as curiosities, objects of fascination, of study, of quiet entertainment. The same houses that had once been shuttered in shame now drew visitors eager to stand where something dreadful had occurred. Fear was giving way to curiosity, and curiosity was becoming an industry. It began innocently enough, with the growing appetite for knowledge. Victorians collected everything: insects, fossils, foreign relics, and strange specimens from the expanding empire. Why not human behavior too? The idea of cataloguing evil appealed to the same tidy impulses that filled parlors with labeled jars and glass cases. Criminology was still young, forensic science younger still, and the boundaries between scholarship and spectacle were uncertain. To study murder was to confront the ultimate mystery: what happens when civilization fails? London's first exhibitions of crime were neither museums nor memorials. They were curiosities, private collections shown to the curious. Police evidence, death masks, and sketches of notorious murderers began to circulate quietly among the fascinated middle classes. The same people who avoided the slums by daylight would pay a shilling to see the relics of their violence displayed under glass. The paradox did not trouble them. The city's moral order was built on such contradictions. By the 1870s, the line between education and entertainment had thinned. The Chamber of Horrors at Madame Tussauds had begun as an exhibition of political figures and historical villains, but soon expanded to include scenes of recent crimes. Wax figures of murderers stood beside models of their victims, arranged with unnerving precision. Visitors walked through in near silence, not out of respect, but out of absorption. The air smelled faintly of wax and sawdust, a simulation of the real thing, sanitized yet intimate. Newspapers fed the same appetite. Serialized stories of famous murders were reprinted with lavish illustrations. The public devoured them not for terror, but for familiarity. A murder read about in the illustrated police news or the penny illustrated paper could be safely experienced at the breakfast table. The very act of reading became an assertion of distance. One was no longer part of the darkness, only its observer. This transformation was not unique to London. Paris had its Musée de la Préfecture de Police, and New York would later have its murder tours. But nowhere did the phenomenon feel more personal than in Victorian England, where morality and curiosity existed side by side. The same hand that wrote sermons against sin might also subscribe to true crime journals. The fascination with evil became a mirror, one that allowed polite society to contemplate its own fears without naming them. The murder house became a cultural object. Real homes where tragedies had occurred were spoken of in travel guides and evening papers. Some were rented by showmen, others simply lingered in rumor, drawing those who wished to see the ordinary made infamous. Curtains twitched, neighbors watched. In these pilgrimages, the Victorian city turned into a museum without walls. Its artifacts were not preserved behind glass, but within the urban landscape itself. Even literature joined the display. Writers like Dickens, Collins, and later Stevenson understood that the line between crime and curiosity was thin. Their novels invited readers to wander through the same foggy streets, to peer into the same shuttered windows, to feel the same chill of fascination without consequence. The Gothic and the domestic merged. Horror was now part of everyday life, a controlled shiver served safely in print. There was, beneath all of it, a strange moral logic. To examine evil, Victorians believed, was to guard against it. The exhibitions, the books, the discussions all claimed to educate, to improve, to illuminate the darker side of human nature. Yet the result was often the opposite. The more they studied crime, the more it became familiar, almost comforting in its repetition. The unknown was transformed into pattern, the monstrous into curiosity. Some reformers protested. They argued that such displays cheapened human suffering, that they turned tragedy into pastime. But their voices were faint against the hum of popular interest. The age of reason had made emotion suspect. Horror was now only acceptable if it could be observed at a distance. The murder house, the wax figure, the newspaper illustration all promised the same thing: fear without consequence. By the closing years of the century, London had fully absorbed its darkness. It had learned not to hide it, but to frame it. The city's crimes had become part of its identity, its stories, its theatre, its nightly news. The Victorians, who once feared contamination by proximity, now sought a kind of safety and familiarity. To name a crime, to see it displayed, was to believe it controlled. But the transformation carried a quiet irony. In making murder into curiosity, they ensured that it would never truly die. The city continued to feed on its own shadows, retelling and reshaping them until fear became heritage. The dark alleys that once echoed with footsteps became tourist routes. The houses that once hid whispers became landmarks. London had found a new way to remember, not by forgetting, but by commodifying. The fascination outlasted its creators. When the century ended and the gaslights began to fade, the exhibitions remained, the newspapers continued, and the visitors still came. The wax figures gathered dust, the railings rusted, but the curiosity endured. It still does. By the final decades of the 19th century, the old terror that had once gripped London began to wane. The city that had fed on darkness was now learning to illuminate it, literally and metaphorically. Reformers spoke of progress, moralists of renewal, engineers of innovation. Electric light, that soft hum of modernity, began to replace the flickering gas lamps. Streets once steeped in shadow now glowed with a steady brilliance, and with each newly lit boulevard, another ghost seemed to vanish. The night itself was changing shape. London was determined to forget what it had been. The slums that had housed generations of invisible lives were being cleared under the guise of urban improvement. Whole neighborhoods, the same labyrinths that had hidden the century's most infamous crimes, were razed, replaced by model dwellings, factories and train lines. Reform societies, social workers, and philanthropists moved through the remnants of those districts with notebooks and moral purpose. Poverty, once seen as a moral failing, was being reframed as a social problem. The language was new, but the impulse was old: to control, to cleanse, to impose order on chaos. The electric age promised safety, and for a time, it seemed to deliver it. No longer did the citizen have to fear the unlit corners of Whitechapel or Southwark. The orange glow of electric bulbs poured into windows, softened the edges of alleys, and drove away the sense of lurking menace. Policemen no longer patrolled by the faint glimmer of a lantern, but under the confidence of steady light. The psychological shift was profound. The night, once imagined as the dominion of danger, became simply another extension of the day. But beneath this new illumination, the memory of fear persisted. The very architecture of London still whispered of what had been: narrow lanes sealed off, soot-stained walls leaning toward one another, old terraced houses whose foundations remembered every tremor of panic. The electric light did not erase the past, it only concealed it. Those who lived through the transition often described the new brilliance with unease. It was not that the city had become safer, only that it had become visible, and visibility brought its own kind of exposure. The moral reformers of the era saw the brightened city as a triumph of reason over vice. They believed that darkness itself was complicit in sin, that the night encouraged the worst instincts of humankind. Thus, to banish darkness was to banish evil. Temperance groups, suffragists, and Christian socialists all embraced this metaphor of illumination. Light was purity, shadow was shame. The city became a moral experiment conducted on a grand scale. Yet the more light was cast, the deeper the psychological shadows seemed to stretch. The press, once obsessed with the spectacle of blood, began to turn its attention elsewhere, to empire, politics, invention. Crime had lost its monopoly on imagination. The Victorian murder house, once a place of pilgrimage, became a relic of a less sophisticated past. Curiosity remained, but the trembling awe had gone. What replaced it was a colder analytical interest, a precursor to the modern true crime fascination, detached and procedural. Murder was no longer the city's secret heartbeat, it was now a statistic. And yet, despite the brightening streets, fear found new shapes. It seeped into psychology, into the language of hysteria and repression that the coming century would explore in earnest. The old anxieties of the alley were replaced by subtler inward ones, the fear of losing one's mind, one's moral footing, one's place in the world. If the earlier Victorians had feared the knife in the dark, the late Victorians feared the instability within themselves. In this new era of clarity, shadows retreated from the streets and settled quietly inside the human mind. Writers noticed the change before the historians did. The Gothic novel, once preoccupied with castles and graveyards, moved inward into drawing rooms, institutions, and the subconscious. Stevenson's Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde spoke of the duality of man, the idea that evil no longer stalked the streets but lived within. Bram Stoker's Dracula brought foreign darkness into the heart of London, a metaphor for the city's fear that its past could never truly die, only evolve. The Victorian night had been banished, but it had left something behind, an inheritance of dread dressed in modern clothes. Even the architecture betrayed its nostalgia. The new buildings, larger, brighter, more uniform, lacked the hidden corners of their predecessors. Windows grew wider, doors more imposing, facades cleaner, yet something essential had been lost. The intimacy of secrecy, where once fear had crept quietly between bricks and mortar, now transparency ruled. But in this new order, the city felt curiously less human, as if the light itself had drained it of mystery. The reformers congratulated themselves. The electric age had conquered the fog, the vice, and the fear. But those who remembered the old streets knew that the city's soul had only changed costume. The darkness that once lingered in the alleys now lived in memory, in dreams, in the quiet corners of the mind. The Victorians, for all their progress, could never truly escape their ghosts. They had merely taught them to live under brighter lights. The night, of course, still came. The lamps hummed, the air thickened, and for a few quiet hours before dawn, London still remembered what it had been, a city of shadows, secrecy, and soft, watchful fear. The difference now was that the fear had no place to go. It existed only in recollection, in the stories people told to feel the thrill of the darkness they had once lived with daily. And so, even as the city modernized, its memory did not. Beneath the wires and bulbs, the old map still pulsed, a ghostly echo of lanes, of footsteps, of unsolved cries in the night. Fear had declined, yes, but it had not disappeared. It had simply learned to whisper where once it had screamed. The years passed quietly, and London, in its endless rhythm of renewal, shed layer after layer of its past. Yet beneath its modern surfaces, fragments of the old city still persisted. A few terraced houses stood forgotten between newer facades, their bricks sunken and soot-darkened, their windows clouded with age. They were not the grand relics of empire, nor the celebrated monuments of progress. They were ordinary houses, once alive with voices, now occupied by silence. They belonged to no one, and yet they seemed to watch the city that had outgrown them. Tour guides sometimes stopped outside these homes, their voices low as if afraid to disturb whatever lingered within. They spoke of the murder houses of Victorian London, places where ordinary domestic walls had borne witness to unspeakable acts. But what drew people to these places now was not horror, nor even curiosity. It was something subtler, a desire to listen to the silence that had replaced the screams. The modern visitor stood before those windows, not to imagine crime, but to sense the passage of time itself, the way wood, plaster, and air can remember. Inside, the air hung thick, dust moved like a faint, slow mist, stirred only by footsteps. The floorboards creaked not with fear, but with fatigue, the weight of a century pressing down. Wallpaper peeled in slow curls, revealing patterns long forgotten, each layer a quiet record of lives lived and lost. The smell was not unpleasant, just heavy, the scent of rot, paper, and old iron. Those who entered often described the same sensation, that of being watched, not by ghosts, but by the house itself. Historians and restorers who worked in these homes learned to move gently. They spoke little, aware that sound carried differently here. Some noted that the acoustics of such rooms, small, irregular, shaped by narrow corridors, seemed to absorb voices rather than echo them. It was as if the architecture had learned silence. A fireplace might still bear traces of soot from coal fires, long gone cold. A stair railing, smooth with wear, might hold the faint warmth of generations of hands. These houses had outlived their inhabitants, their purposes, even their reputations. They remained because the city could not quite decide what to do with them: demolish, preserve, or simply ignore. The ghosts that occupied these places were architectural, not spiritual. A cracked window pane could whisper of poverty, a sealed basement could murmur of secrecy. The houses no longer needed stories of murder to be unsettling. Their geometry alone, the tight stairwells, the dividing walls, the half-light that filtered through lace curtains, was enough to suggest unease. They were designed for privacy, built to conceal, and in their emptiness, that design persisted. Each room was a compartment of memory, a relic of a time when secrecy was not a flaw, but a virtue. Modern restoration often aimed to bring light and air into these spaces to make them livable again. But in doing so, something essential was always lost. The tightness of the rooms, the dimness of the hallways, the heaviness of the air, all of it had been part of the architecture's language. When the walls were stripped, the floorboards sanded, the result was cleanliness but not truth. These houses had been built to contain human lives, in all their warmth and cruelty. To sanitize them was to erase the faint imprint of history's breath. In some cases, the stories of the murders themselves had faded almost entirely. The names were forgotten, the crimes unsolved or sensationalized beyond recognition. What remained was atmosphere, an almost tangible residue of emotion pressed into the fabric of the space. Psychologists once dismissed such sensations as suggestion, but architects began to recognize a subtler truth, that form and feeling are not easily separated. The Victorians, for all their obsession with morality, had built homes that mirrored their contradictions. Every wall was a boundary, every corridor a confession. Walking through such a house today feels like walking through an echo. The modern city hums faintly outside. Buses, sirens, the rhythm of traffic, but within, time moves differently. The house seems to breathe slowly, as if exhaling the century it has held. In certain corners, light never quite reaches. In others, a draft stirs the curtain like a quiet sigh. There are no footsteps, only the faint vibration of the world beyond. The past has not died here, it has settled into the walls, patient and unassuming. Sometimes, photographers visit these spaces, capturing them before they vanish. Their images reveal more than the eye can see. The slow collapse of ceilings, the delicate erosion of plaster, the strange serenity that comes when human presence fades. The photos do not depict horror, they depict stillness. A kind of acceptance that all architecture in time becomes archaeology. What was once alive becomes studied. What was once a home becomes an artifact. A few of these homes have been preserved intentionally, marked with plaques that speak of historical incidents, but most are unmarked. They stand in quiet rows, indistinguishable from their neighbors. Perhaps someone lives there now, unaware of what once occurred in the room above, or unwilling to dwell on it. The city moves forward, indifferent to what it has buried in brick and mortar. Yet, for those who know where to look, the signs remain. A warped lintel, a bricked-up doorway, a patch of wall where new paint refuses to settle. It is easy to imagine that ghosts haunt such places, but the truth is simpler and stranger. The buildings themselves remember. They remember the years of coal and gas, of fog and footsteps, of voices calling through thin walls. They remember the fear, but also the ordinary, the tea cooling on a table, the clock ticking in the hall. What lingers is not horror, but density, the accumulated weight of human presence, compacted into silence. In the end, the ghosts of architecture are not supernatural at all. They are the byproduct of time, of habitation, of memory becoming matter. The Victorians built for permanence, but permanence brings with it a strange kind of haunting. To endure is to remember. And as long as these walls stand, the city's old darkness, its secrecy, its sorrow, its fascination with death, will continue to hum softly beneath the paint and plaster, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it. And beyond these remnants, beyond the last standing terrace and the final echo of coal smoke, lies something quieter still, not the memory of fear, but the acceptance of its end. In the end, all stories return to quiet. The great noise of the city, the rattle of carriages, the strike of boots on cobblestone, the cry of market vendors, has long faded into the soft hum of traffic, of modern life, moving on without looking back. Yet beneath it all, there remains a stillness that does not belong to the present. It hides in corners, in the cracks between walls, in the breath of houses too old to remember who last crossed their thresholds. It is not a silence of emptiness, but of endurance, a calm, unbroken presence that outlives the living. The old houses of Victorian London, those that have not been replaced or swallowed by glass and steel, sit quietly now. Their bricks, dulled by soot and rain, seem to have settled into a kind of resignation. Some have been restored, others left to lean gently against the weight of years. A few stand behind new facades, their original forms buried beneath layers of plaster and paint. Yet, if one listens closely, even through the insulation and the echo of modern plumbing, one can sense the deep hum of age, the memory of footsteps long faded, the rhythm of past lives, still pulsing faintly within the walls. No one speaks of fear anymore. The murders that once filled newspapers and nightmares have become mere anecdotes, their details softened by time. The houses that witness them no longer invite dread, they invite reflection. The violence they once contained has dissolved into abstraction, leaving behind only traces, faint stains beneath the wallpaper, a discolored patch on the floor, a whisper of disquiet in the air. But even these remnants are not sinister, they are historical sediment, the residue of human experience. The city has forgotten the blood, but remembered the architecture. When historians walk these streets, they do so with quiet reverence. They do not seek ghosts, nor do they chase the thrill of mystery. They study the lines, the proportions, the way the narrowness of corridors once dictated the closeness of life. They note how the placement of windows controlled the flow of air, how basements doubled as both shelter and prison. Each observation is an act of listening, of hearing what the houses cannot say. The silence of these places is not emptiness, it is language. And perhaps that is what the Victorians, in their obsession with privacy and decorum, never understood, that every wall tells a story, whether one wishes it to or not. The parlours that once hid scandal, the bedrooms that saw despair, the kitchens that heard whispered prayers, all now speak only through their materials. Plaster remembers pressure, wood remembers warmth, stone remembers weight. What once was hidden now exists only as texture, as atmosphere. The architecture itself has become a kind of historian, recording the slow passage of everything that once mattered. There is a certain peace in this decay. In rooms where people once trembled or wept, there is now only the steady rhythm of time reclaiming its space. Dust settles evenly. Sunlight falls in quiet angles. The houses, stripped of purpose, have become vessels of neutrality, No longer homes, no longer prisons, just spaces through which air moves. The ghosts of the Victorian night have not vanished. They have been absorbed into the slow respiration of the city. They exist not as apparitions, but as temperature, as scent, as the faint chill that lingers in a doorway at dusk. Outside, the city continues to breathe, though differently now. Electric light has long replaced gas. The fog is thinner, the nights are warmer. But in certain pockets, an alley that has escaped redevelopment, a stairwell that retains its original wood, the air feels heavier, as though it remembers the century that once defined it. The people are gone, the crimes forgotten, yet the houses hold their silence as if guarding a confidence too fragile to break. Visitors sometimes describe an odd calm when standing in these places, not fear, but awareness, a gentle reminder that everything leaves an imprint, and that architecture, unlike memory, does not forget easily. The stillness is not haunted, it is contemplative. It asks for nothing, expects nothing. It simply endures, marking the thin line between presence and absence, between what once was and what remains. The Victorians built for eternity, though few of them understood what eternity truly meant. They could not have known that their houses would one day stand empty, admired by strangers who came not to live but to remember. Nor could they have imagined that their private tragedies would become public history, catalogued and studied until all that was personal had turned abstract. And yet, in their endurance, these houses achieved something rare. They transcended their own purpose. They became monuments, not to fear, but to time. In the silence of these empty houses, history ceases to move. It pauses, breathes, and waits. The creak of the floorboards is not the echo of footsteps but of centuries adjusting themselves. The still air is not dead, only patient. Every sound, every shadow, every mote of dust becomes part of the same quiet continuum, a world where the living and the long gone coexist, not in conflict, but in calm. And so the story ends not with revelation, but with stillness. The fog has lifted, the lamps have dimmed. The city, for all its progress, still carries within it the heartbeat of what it once was, faint, slow, persistent. The silence that fills these empty houses is not absence, but presence of another kind. The presence of history itself, breathing softly through wood and stone. In that quiet, one can almost hear it, the last whisper of a city that once never slept. A murmur from the bricks, the timbers, the shadows that remain. Not a haunting but a remembrance. Not a warning, but a sigh. The sound of a century finally at rest,